I will introduce you to our chair for the day, Professor Kathryn Moore. Kathryn is a professor of landscape architecture at Birmingham City University, and she is the world president of the International Federation for Landscape Architects and was a previous president of the Landscape Institute. I first remember meeting Kathryn about 4 or 5 years ago. She came to one of the very first Trees and Design Action Group meetings that I ordered in the Midlands. And she came with this amazing vision for the landscape where she'd been kind of looking at Birmingham and looking at the old geographical maps and colouring them in and thinking about how we could kind of encourage and realise and celebrate what the landscape has to offer and use that to drive urban design moving forward. And I thought it was the most amazing thing that I'd ever heard. And so I'm really pleased to be able to hand over to Kathryn today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not apologising for using a Mac. I do really wish it was easier. So, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today, and I'm really pleased to be here. I'm a member of the Natural England Landscape Advisory Panel. I was asked to give an introduction at a meeting that we had. I just sort of went for it, really. So, and I think that the main thing is that the recent announcements from DEFRA that we've been hearing are very encouraging. We've got the new Environmental Improvement Plan to halt the decline of nature and deliver the Environment Act through specific targets and deadlines. There's a commitment to ensure that every policy in each DEFRA department has to consider its impact on the environment. Natural England's green infrastructure principles, and we've got the proposed integration of different budgets across farming, forestry, flooding and investment from water companies. And then there's the convening of county level projects for natural nature recovery and calls to create 15-minute cities to give urban populations more access to nature through green and blue infrastructure. These are really important steps forward. It's building momentum, but it is not yet enough. We need to be braver, we need to be more ambitious, more determined to deal with the global challenges that we face, and far less comfortable. And that brings me to the West Midlands National Park. So now I've got to be multitasking now. How do I move this on? No. It's not doing it. Down on the right side. Where's he gone? I don't know. This is compared to my screen.
You tell me when you want the next slide.
Next slide. Oh, we've got to, no, wait. Okay, so no, you can go to the next slide, yes. So it's just one. I want you to think about where you grew up and how that, gosh, it's a bit high, how that shapes your culture, your identity, your values, your beliefs, things that you remember. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about landscape. How do I do the next one? You've done it. Oh, I'm sorry to do it on here. Oh, God, okay. I've got a background in derelict land reclamation and habitat creation and woodland management. A lot of what I'm talking about comes from research that's been going on for 30 years at BCU, ending at redefining theories of perception, which I won't go into the details now. But one of the main things that is relevant today is that we're in the habit of dividing nature from culture, art from science, biodiversity from landscape, all sorts of dichotomies, which I think are deeply problematic. So what I realised from my research, that's just one way of looking at the world, and it's time for a different approach. So we get away with this little interface between us and the world and realise that the way we make sense of the world is entirely down to what we know and the concepts that we have and the knowledge that we have. The West Midlands National Park, therefore, crosses these traditional silos of science and art, nature and culture. And what we're doing in the lab based at Birmingham City University is to compile, curate and map multiple layers of data at scale to develop knowledge of the bigger picture. to generate hidden or forgotten ways of seeing the landscape, understanding the landscape, to unite communities and to give hope and confidence and to contribute to future resilience. So the West Midlands National Park is not about just about nature or restoring biodiversity, although of course it does include those activities. We use drawing and mapping, as Emma said, colouring in, to begin to understand what's really there, which is a really powerful way of analysis because you can't get away from the materiality of the landscape. Okay. Oh, am I supposed to be doing?
You want to be on the next one, do you?
On here. Okay, right. So largely it's about knowing where you are. So I know there are lots of people who are watching now who are probably not from the West Midlands and probably perhaps not even been here. This amazing map from Grasshopper Geography shows the river systems in the UK. The West Midlands is largely that yellow one in the middle. And it meets the blue one. So this is the two largest river systems in the UK that's come together. The watershed between these two systems is here. And so the West Midlands is this is the Tame River Basin that we're focusing on. It covers more or less the geography of the West Midlands Combined Authority. The dark areas there are the built-up areas with Birmingham and the Black Country, and the catchment of the Tame is in white. At this area, for those of you who don't know, is the Black Country is a geopark, UNESCO geopark. It's got over 2,000 sites of special interest. It's an amazing, extraordinary place, really. It's the crucible of the Industrial Revolution. In other words, it's been dug up and ravaged over the centuries, dug up and exploited for centuries, which means that we have there's a special case of the West Midlands National Park, special case of the, what's it called? Special case, the West Midlands Anthropocene, that's right. So this map took me about 5 years to get hold of, but it shows the landfills, about 92 square kilometres of landfill in the Black Country. We're also, as a legacy of the Industrial Revolution, of course, we've got an amazing network of canals. It's slightly confusing map because we're in part insets in there, but nonetheless, it's an amazing system of waterways. So in the Black Country, the land was dug up, the minerals and everything was processed there and put on the canals to come to Birmingham. This is Birmingham in 1731, but by oops, sorry, that was a bit too quick. But by 1889, it was known as the City of 1,000 Trades. We've got remnants of this, of course, including the amazing Smethwick-Galton Bridge, which is this extraordinary bridge and this incredible cutting, 3.66 kilometres long, 21 metres deep, dug out by hand, designed by Thomas Telford. And really, so what we've got here is this huge area it's inextricably linked to the imaginations of these men. I have to say that, men. And so we're driven by the idea of progress. And I don't mean to insult anybody by saying it just happens that they are. The West Midlands Lab, what we're trying to do is reimagine in the region based on 21st century idea of progress. And why West Midlands National Park? Because I was in the meeting, this is from 10 years ago, and so the leader of the council said, we have pumped billions into the city and we haven't made one bit of difference to the multiple deprivation indices. And so to my mind, that means we're not doing it in the right way and we do need to have a different approach. So we've set up the lab and an advisory group and the West Midlands National Park Foundation Board that's chaired by Fiona Reynolds. We challenge, provoke, inspire different kinds of behaviours. The approach that we have is based on a new idea of landscape. As I said before, as the response that we have to our physical, cultural context of our lives, right? It's not just the blue stuff and the green stuff. And that response is as important to people in First Nations as it is to people in Sandwell or in Birmingham or in Thurrock, or the places that we've worked in over the years. And working with this new approach means that we don't recognise that natural systems don't stop where the buildings start, that we don't have to divide constantly splinter the environment into different bits and pieces. Landscape isn't just the green stuff and the blue stuff, that we can recognise the value, the economic value of hope, identity and self-confidence. And it's a way to really, it's an integrated vision to achieve the levelling up agenda and to reduce health disparities. So the crux of the matter is that the quality of the environment is directly proportional to the quality of people's lives. And that's a fairly simple, compelling equation. But that equation is almost entirely absent in economic models and institutional governance structures, which is what we're working on. So it's about beginning to realise aesthetics. I don't mean aesthetics in a traditional sense, but look at this. This is the church from Four Weddings and a Funeral next to Procter & Gamble. And you've got these extraordinary landscapes just a little bit further down the Thames, not the Tame, where you've got this urban, the ability to hold the urban within the rural. It's about when these kids from Whitton thinking, knowing that their school got wet, but they didn't know they got wet because there was a river. They didn't know what a river was. They didn't know the river was just a few hundred, well, less than that, meters from their school. But then they didn't know what lived in the river or what the environment was. So for them, they will never forget that. That's had a profound effect on them. It also means recognising the concept of the everyday landscape. In other words, it gives a voice to the everyday landscape, not just the special, beautiful stuff that is designated, but the everyday landscape. So it's a very democratic concept. So the issues are that although the landscape is of profound significance, it really has no single champion, no obvious constituency. And so what we want to do is to put the quality of life and the landscape in these broader terms at the top of the political agenda. So it's a big 30-year spatial vision to address the challenges that we face, not just here in the West Midlands, but to do with the climate emergency, regeneration, environment, transport, identity, infrastructure, employment, all those sorts of things that are affecting all of us. And it's a new way of looking at how we might approach that. So it's like looking at the world from the other end of the telescope. And what we're doing is changing attitudes, perceptions and values about the land by seeing the bigger picture and realising that it's worth paying, really is very worth paying attention to the resources that we have and not be profligate with it anymore. But this is one of the first drawings that we did for it, which is people think it's Mordor, but it's not that. We're actually on that. That's the West Midlands with just inverted the contours and over the map. It's to deal with the issue that the landscape is constantly being eroded. Impossible to think of at a strategic level. We've lost a really important connection with the landscape. For example, oh God, why would anybody think that any of those are a good idea to design or to have in the city? Then it's not a good look. It was not a good idea to. We've lost this cultural and ecological significance. This is the HS2. It's not like this now, I've been assured. Well, what message does that send to people when we know there is such a problem with air quality? And this was the initial proposal for a car park out of Solihull. We've lost the know-how, traditional knowledge. If you want to keep your feet dry when there is a storm, head for medieval church, because they knew where you could go. Whereas now we think we can just go anywhere. And I think the screen definitely has a problem that we've lost the ability to comprehend the landscape at scale. And it's rarely acknowledged that the landscape is the vast infrastructure upon which we depend. And that's what I want you to think of when you're thinking about these concepts. It really is, we depend on it for everything. Soil, air, identity, culture, all those things. Okay, the main thing that we're looking at is obviously to do with water, topography and land and how to change that perception. We're working with people like Transport for West Midlands. This is number 11 bus. Don't know if any of you know it, but we had a fantastic 2.5 hour journey around with Carl Chin, who told the students about that's the Bourne Brook, that's Bearwood. Why do you think it's called Bearwood? It's because there was a wood there. So it's beginning to make the connections between ideas, physical place and identity and topography and water. An absolutely incredible thing. So I'll just move quickly on. one of the big issues that we're finding is, you know, these are the rivers and streams of the in Birmingham. I've been told so many times we haven't. Oh, it's a good job we haven't got a river. No, we've got loads, but they're quite little. And one of my students said, Kathryn, the rivers don't follow the contours. Of course they don't, because it's been piped and all the rest of it. It just, we put industry on the floodplains of the Tame. Whose idea was that? So we've got these floodplains that don't operate as floodplains. They've been tipped on, they've been built on, and now they've got industry on them. And we wonder why it's flooding. This is we've just come up with this recently with Alex Albers has done this, looking at the density of cover. The red is the vegetation and the blue is where there isn't. And you can just see what we've done to the River Tame is very evident. So we're looking at how we can improve water quality. Look at those streams, they're shocking. Right, that's part of the infrastructure. That's the headwaters of the Tame, that's what it looks like. How can we change that and become a region of 1,000 rivers and streams? How can we have 1,000 rainwater pools and miles of suds? And actually begin to evoke the spirits of the Tame. This is from 1622. As you can see there, amazing book. And create 1,000 parks and squares. So I think because we're short of time, I need to stop right at the moment.
Thank you, Kathryn, for this lovely introduction, and thank you everyone for being here and online as well. It's an honor and a pleasure for us to host this workshop. It's the first of the ones we've funded, so we're really, really excited.
We're off.
Oh, thank you. So Reclaim stands for Reclaim Forgotten Cities, turning cities from vulnerable spaces to healthy places for people. And it's a 1.2 million network grant led by the University of Surrey in collaboration with the Centre of Ecology and Hydrology and the University of Warwick, Bangor, and Bath. These are my co-investigators. Professor Prashant Kumar is the PI. And as a networking grant, its aim is to consolidate a network of people interested in these issues. And this is something really, really important for us. So when applying for the grant, we were thinking, how does one create a network around these issues? Like, what are the activities that might encourage or support these new forms of engagement, understanding that the network is funded by the UKRI from the EPSRC, so the Engineering and Physical Science Research Council, but also with the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Natural Environment Research Council, which means that it's an interdisciplinary grant from its conceptualization. And how do we do this? So one of the aims of Reclaim is to have a cross-sectoral and as broad as possible, geographically speaking, as possible. So we've designed and have already started several activities that I'll go very, very briefly through. First, an urban green space and people call, which is already closed and it's been already funded, which is now 9 projects, small projects that explicitly address gaps in our knowledge of GBGI effectiveness against multiple outcomes, including social justice and equity. So what are the knowledge gaps and how can we provide data to understand what these multifunctional spaces are doing? These are the universities awarded. You can see the maximum was 40K. We had a workshop call, of which 5 have already been granted. This is the first one. And the idea is to have one-day workshops where we can explore either specific GBGI infrastructures on site or a specific topic. And they're designed and conceptualized as networking events and knowledge exchange opportunities so everyone can learn from each other. Thank you, Dr. Emma Ferrari, for organizing this one. We're really, really excited of this opportunity. And the next one is going to be Natural History Consortium, 14th of June, and everyone is very welcome. We also have had secondments. The first call happened already. We will have another one for professionals moving to different institutions, people from institutions going to business. So basically secondments so that people can exchange from a practical perspective. And we've had 2 so far. And then another big chunk of the budget and something very important for the network has been these horizon scanning and synthesis studies. The horizon scanning workshop took place in October 22, and it was an open call, and anyone from any background attended. And the idea was to find how to group and what are the areas that deserve attention in order to collect this database on the benefits of green and blue infrastructures. So these are the different teams that have been gathered, and each team got 15K to coordinate the review. We are also having webinar series. They're ongoing. Next week is the next one, so you're very welcome to attend. And they've included a wide number of professionals, researchers, people from business, and they're 1 hour lunchtime, so very convenient. And you can also check them online, so you don't have to be there on time. But what is very interesting is that the amount of the wide variety, let's say, of participants is building kind of database, if you will, of what people are doing at the moment. If anyone wants to present, please send us an email. There's almost 500 members at the moment of the network, representing more than 40 countries. And the background of the members is quite interesting because there's lots of academics, but we're trying to increase the amount of people from charities, consultancy services, governmental bodies, etc. And also different interest areas. So public health and well-being is very strong, but also people have different interests and aims. Then being a member of the network is free. So please join us at reclaim-network.org. And follow us on Twitter or LinkedIn. The advantage of being part of the network is that you receive monthly updates on what we're doing, opportunities, and also, as mentioned at the beginning, it intends to have to build a database not only of data on the benefits of the infrastructures, but also in terms of who is actually working, interested in, and researching on these issues. So it's going to be a database also of professionals and people working in these areas. And just to conclude, we would like to invite you to a networking event that will take place on the 11th of September. And it's open to the public, free, and we will present more specifically the results of what's been happening for the first year. Started March last year, so we are already 1 year on, and a great opportunity for everyone to mingle and network and meet each other. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much for having me here today. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to Birmingham. And it's so wonderful to be talking about not only trees, but also talking about climate resilience. I spend half my life in one of 2 rooms. It's either a room with built environment practitioners and infrastructure operators thinking about climate resilience and adaptation, or it's with the Trees and Design Action Group, the community, thinking about the practical realities of how to plant trees in urban landscapes. So it's absolutely brilliant to have everybody in one room today. It's almost as if I designed it. So Before I get into talking about urban heat, which is the presentation I wanted to start off with today, I just wanted to mention the Trees and Design Action Group. Many of you will be aware of what we do. We are a network and a charity. We organise workshops and webinars. So many of the people presenting here today help out in the TDAG network. Today's event was pulled together by myself, Sue James, who is doing an awesome job managing everything online, and also Andy Hirons, who is speaking later. And as a network, we respond to consultations, we try and share best practice research, we produce best practice guides. And in doing so, we provide this cross-sector forum for working and trying to make sure that everybody is on the same page when we're talking about how to improve our urban green infrastructure. In terms of guides, we have all sorts of different things available online. There's some really big, heavy, detailed things, such as trees in hard landscape, trees planning and development, and Andy's tree species selection guide. They're available online, and they have the real detail that you need to make decisions within urban areas. We also have some guides which are only 4 sides long, and these are about providing a kind of a holistic overview of a really important topic for our urban areas, and then giving you the detailed links that you need to go on and find more stuff about it. We also have a YouTube channel, and we're catching up with the modern day slowly but surely. And here we have all of the past webinars that we have recorded over the last couple of years, and some of our discussive sessions. Today's session is thinking about trees above ground, and it's part of a 6 seminar series that we're running this year. We first of all started thinking about how to design with trees back in February. Today we're thinking about above ground, and in June and July we'll be thinking about the underground conflicts that we can get, and then thinking more about funding and other topics towards the end of the year. If you're not a member of the TDAG network, sign up. You can contact either myself or Sue James, and I'm sure that at some point our email addresses will appear in the chat. So for people who are in the room, I have kindly put out one of our first TDAG First Steps guides. You'll see, this one is obviously very relevant for the event today. And it's thinking about the urban heat, the built environment, and trees and green infrastructure. I'll come on to that in a moment. Another guide that's particularly relevant for the things we're talking about today is something we produced last year. It's called First Steps in Trees and New Developments. And this one is thinking about the future. You know, if we want to have these beautiful green treescapes that we all aspire to have, that we stand underneath and feel the shade from in the future when we will have more hot weather, then we need to be growing our trees really big. And if you want to grow a tree really big, one of the first things you can do is not chop it down in the first place. And that's sort of the premise of First Steps in Trees and New Developments. It's got tips and strategies for engineers, for planners, for tree officers on how we can try and work on the new developments that are taking place in our urban areas, to understand what trees we have there already, to think about how we can protect them for the future, and then enhance the beauty that they are already giving us. So, on to summer 2022 and thinking about urban heat. I don't think you'll need me to tell you that last summer was really hot. It was, we had some of the highest daily temperatures on record. It was 40 degrees in the UK, and it was 38 degrees in Birmingham. And when you see these numbers from the Met Office, they are telling you the temperature that a thermometer inside a Stevenson screen measured inside a Met enclosure. And so if you're living in an urban area, then it will have been hotter than these official temperatures. And I remember standing on my driveway. I live in southwest Birmingham, and it was in the week of July when we had this hot temperature. And I remember breathing in the air, and it didn't feel like British air. It felt like the Mediterranean. It was really dry and it was warm inside my nose. And it just felt fundamentally wrong to be experiencing this hot, dry, arid temperatures within leafy green Bourneville. The disconnect was quite surreal. And it was also, it felt quite dystopian as well, because I could also smell smoke, because in the distance there were the forest fires at Lickey Hills. So it was a really hot temperature and a really kind of alarming wake-up call for me of what is going to start to happen more and more often as we move forward. It wasn't just Birmingham that was hot. The whole of the UK was 1.5 to 2 degrees warmer than average last summer. And that's when we say warmer than average, this isn't an average from 1960 to 1990. This is an average from the past 30 years. So it's warmer than already warmer stuff. And it was also very, very dry as well. There are lots of great graphics you can see that talk about how the climate is changing and climate projections. I'm sure you've seen kind of the blue going into the red stripes, and I think someone's got that on a slide later. For me, this is the most alarming graphic of all. This shows you the top 10 hottest days on record over the last 120 years. And you can see that with the exception of a very warm day in 1911, all of the last hot days have happened in the last 30 years. And you can almost see the line kind of ramping up towards the end, you know, the hockey stick flicking up. And it has got so hot in the last 10 years. And I don't know if you remember 2018, it was hot and dry in Birmingham. My grass turned yellow, and summers like that, which are kind of just warm and dry, will be happening every other year by 2050. I also wanted to think a little bit about rainfall. The Met Office strapline for the future is that we will have hotter, drier summers, but we will also have a greater chance of warmer, wetter winters, and that more frequent heavy rainfall events will be taking place as well. So we'll have these really hot, dry summers. Temperatures will be hotter. Heat waves may or may not last for longer duration, and the average temperature will be warmer, but these will be punctuated by short duration, heavy rainfall events. And when we're thinking about managing our urban landscape so that we can grow trees in this changing climate, these are the kind of things we need to be factoring in. So, as I'm sure you're all aware, urban areas are warmer than surrounding rural areas. And there are two main reasons for this. Number one is that in comparison to our rural areas, if you think about them kind of green, leafy farmland, in contrast to the rural areas, urban areas have a lot of stuff in them, and that stuff gets warm. And then at night time, it's really difficult for all that stuff to cool down because we have a lower view of sky, so there's less kind of cooling by radiation. And so as heat builds through a hot summer period, it starts to really increase in the summer, increase in urban areas because it's storing more heat during the day and it's storing more heat at night. And so it starts that little bit warmer. And so that's how you can really start to get a big difference in between the rural and the urban, and this urban heat island effect in summer. I don't want to talk too much about how you can use green infrastructure to cool climates because we have Maddie for that. But generally, if you're wanting to create a cool place, you need it to be able to cool down at night. So you need to be able to see a big view of sky, and then you need to think about how you can use other green infrastructure for cooling and via evapotranspiration and also by providing shade. Other basic steps for built environment practitioners, if you're thinking about designing for the future and thinking about urban heat, just think about your city, think about or your town, you know, where is it hottest? And you probably know exactly where it is. It's going to be the area where you've got most artificial surfaces where you've got the most compact form and least green infrastructure. And then if you do have the opportunity to plan strategically, you want to try and move residential homes away from the hottest parts of the city, because the urban heat island effect is often most intense at night because we're not having that cooling down during the day and people are inside their homes, which are then hot. If you do have to develop in an urban heat island area, just think about the site design and the materials. Can you create this big sky view to encourage radiative cooling at night? Can you use green infrastructure? Can you use cooling materials? And you can also, if you have existing developments, you can assess building overheating risk. And there's some really great methods online that are available to look at online from SIPSI. And number 5 is a bit of a catchphrase. It's never too late to mitigate. And I think, you know, we don't have to accept that our city is going to be hot and miserable in the future. We can do something about it. So the last thing I wanted to touch on very briefly is some research that we've been doing at the University of Birmingham. In 2016, I wrote a fellowship application and it was called Bringing the Mediterranean to Birmingham. And I didn't quite expect it to happen during the fellowship time, but the idea of the whole premise of this research project was thinking about how we can make our cities and the infrastructure within them resilient to future climate, and with this focus on nature-based solutions. And so one of the things we've been doing with Birmingham City Council is we've been trying to think about how we can map heat vulnerability and climate vulnerability across the region, using open access data sets and creating a method that anybody in any local authority should be able to use. So if you're thinking about heat vulnerability, it probably can be approximated using 3 or 4 different things. Firstly is surface temperature, so the existing temperature that you receive from the weather, and you can get this from the Met Office. How hot it will probably get in the city will depend upon the urban form, and you can get that by looking at the local climate zones data set, which is available. It's an academic data set, but it's available. Then, of course, the amount of green space you have to kind of open up the sky for radiative cooling and to provide shade. Again, that's an important factor, as is the existing population vulnerability, which you can approximate using indices of multiple deprivation. And so what we've done is we've added these 4 different layers together to create a heat vulnerability map for the city. And this map looks like every other map we always produce of Birmingham. It's always great in the southwest and great in the northeast. And then we have this central swathe where we have lots of different kind of challenges. And so being able to map heat vulnerability in the city is one thing. The next thing is how can we use that as a tool to improve planning? And one of the things that I'd be interested in testing out with anybody else who's interested here is how we can use maps like this to influence the planning process, not so that they're prohibitive and stop planning taking place in areas which are vulnerable to future climate change, but so that they can kind of be the evidence base or the stick that we need to get developers to include a greater amount of green infrastructure in their developments moving forward so that they are ultimately more climate resilient for the future. So this is my last slide, some final thoughts. When we're thinking about urban heat, our cities really feel the urban heat because of the urban heat island effect. And our trees within the cities also really feel that heat. And they also feel the drought because urban areas are hostile to trees. They have many impermeable surfaces. They have little access to natural water anyway. And then we add a drought and urban heat on top of this, it makes it very difficult for them to survive. If we're thinking about how we can create heat resilient treescapes for the future, we also really need to think about water because we will be receiving water as extreme rainfall. So is there a role there for the trees to intercept the rainfall and be part of sustainable urban drainage? We also need to be thinking about the drought conditions and whether they can survive in futures which are not only hotter but drier. But also, if we want these trees to be providing us with a cooling benefit, then they also need water, not just to survive, but in order to be able to evapotranspirate, which I think is a word, but Word didn't. So last but not least, the work that I've shown on mapping today is part of a broader project on climate risk and vulnerability assessment. And if you're interested in doing this, or if you are part of the CPD, the Carbon Disclosure Project, then you need a CRVA map. And so if you're interested in the methods we're developing at Birmingham, please get in touch. And I'm done. Thank you very much for having me.
Right, I'm also, this is Christy, and we work together at Leicester Council. And I'm going to start off talking about how I manage the trees that we already have in the council, mature trees, and Chris will talk a bit more about the planting of new trees. Just out of interest, I know there's a lot of different organisations present here today. How many are here from local authorities? Right, so quite a few. So for you, you will recognise a lot of the issues that we will bring up, I'm sure. If you don't, talk to me afterwards, because then I want to know how you managed. How do I get this forward? That one?
No, next one.
Right, okay. So the Trees and Woodlands team in Leicester it's quite large compared to a lot of other local authorities, and we do everything in-house. So we've got a technical team of 6 people, of which I'm a part of, but we also do all practical work. So we, depending on the budget for what year, we've got between 6 and 10 crews out there actually doing all the tree work on the ground. And that's how I started. I started out as a climber. We've got 168,000 plotted trees within the city boundary that we manage. There's also 111 hectares of woodlands, which is anything from shelter belt, just, dense ash plantations, to little remnants of the original mature forest that was there in the beginning. So a mixture of mature ash and oak. And you can see the picture there is very typical. That's that's the shelter belt. So that's basically ash. And then you've got the remnants of an oak that was probably a hedgerow tree from the beginning. There is a tree strategy that we work towards. I'll make sure the web link is available for you, but basically you can access it on the Leicester City Council website. It's available to the public, and you just search on tree strategy and then you can find it there, and it's quite detailed. Don't worry about the City Mayor's kind of blag in the beginning, just go on the supporting documents and that's where you find the needs. Right, so on a day-to-day basis, these are the sort of the main issues that I think climate change sort of causes us changes in our day-to-day. So I'll go through this a bit more in detail, but obviously temperatures, whether it's hot or whether it's more wet, also the intensity of storms. They come at different times a year and from different directions. That also has an effect on pathogens. So we're getting new pathogens in, and the ones we're used to don't behave the way we're used to because they tend to progress very, very quickly. The drought leads to insurance claims, especially at the moment. Since last summer, obviously, there was like a big bunch of extra insurance claim came in because of subsidence, when you get lessons on a clay soil. So we get a lot of that when it's been dry. So that causes both cost to the council, but also cost to our team, because we're having to remove quite a lot of mature trees because they're causing damage to properties, which we are legally obliged to do. So we try and defend them as well as we can, but if it's clear that it's the tree that is causing it, even if it's sort of minimal damage, then we are legally obliged to remove it. And that plays into another quite controversial issue that we'll come on to later. Okay. So obviously the droughts that we see means that we have to spend a lot more time and staff watering our trees, the newly planted ones. We don't bother watering anything else. And we only plant the heavy stock that we plant. We mainly plant 1618s, which is quite heavy, because we find that anything smaller tends to just get snapped off and vandalized. So normally we have a 98% success rate for our heavy stock. And last year, the failure rate doubled to 4%, and that was due to the hot summer last year. So we're down to 96% success rate, and the whips did really badly because it's not practical to water whips. And also, as you can see, half of them disappeared due to vandalism. Storms. So we're finding very much, and I learned from my daughter is studying agroecology at the moment, and she says that they're worried more about the changing pattern of storms than anything else, because they're much more violent. They're often very gusty. They tend to shed much rain at the same time in a very short period of time. And they come from slightly different directions. And they come at weird times of year. And we have experienced exactly that, I should say, for the last 5-6 years. We have had a lot of very violent storms arriving in the summer. When the trees are in full leaf, they get very wet, they get very heavy, they provide a big sail, and quite often also the ground then becomes very wet because there's a huge deluge at the same time. So it means that trees that would normally be vulnerable tend to fail. And also because they haven't built up the strength in the direction that the wind's coming from. So they fail at much lower wind speeds as well. So that means that we've had to start looking at removing trees that are now not suitable. For example, there's an avenue of Lombardy poplars, mature Lombardy poplars along the ring road, and we have had failures there. And you can see at the top picture, there is actually an ambulance at the back. And that's because one of those
massive mature poplars that you couldn't really see was vulnerable, but it just came over in a high wind and trapped a vehicle. The driver was okay, so that's good. Nobody got seriously hurt, but somebody got seriously scared. And the people living right next to them weren't very happy either. So we're now looking at a programme to remove all the mature poplars next to buildings and roads, and that's a very expensive job. So again, that has direct impact. Pathogens, as I said, there seems to progress very much quicker. We've recently had to do a sanitation programme in Western Park, which is one of the main parks in the city, where we removed across 2 seasons, we removed 80 trees. It was not just one pathogen, it was 2 main pathogens, Phytophthora and red band needle blight. But they became structurally unsafe and they were right next to the main avenue. So we had to take the decision. We've watched them for years and they've been sort of progressing quite slowly, and we've been able to take out, a few every season and had a nice sort of succession going on, but suddenly they all just became unstable. We had to take them all out at once. I've also, a couple of weeks ago, we had a massive big oak tree that looked perfectly healthy, completely full canopy in October when it was last looked at. And it fell across a street and landed in the drive of the person living opposite, where he'd had his very expensive car parked. It was completely flattened and a complete write-off. And even as it came over, there's no way we could have figured out that this tree was not completely sound. If I'd inspected it the week before it fell, I would have said, no chance that's going to fail. But actually, as you can see in the picture, it doesn't have a single healthy root. It's completely decayed. And it came over in no wind, no nothing. It was just time, and it just toppled over. And we just kind of got past it by the skin of our teeth. So, politics. I'd say politics has probably got the biggest impact. The weather changes, the pathogens, a lot of the other things that are science. We can deal with science. We can deal with the change in the physical reality. We sort of know what to do. But as things are changing, trees have become a really hot political issue, both local and nationally. And it means that their whole debate becomes really emotional rather than science-led. And also, as there's an election every 4 years or so, nobody looks any further than 4 years. And in tree time, that's nothing. So, trying to get any trees felled at the moment is bloody murder because there's an election in a few weeks. But, they want all our figures on planting. So it doesn't matter what kind of little sapling we planted, it needs to be included in the tally. And there's this obsession with planting new rather than maintaining the mature. It's like a sort of expendable. You can just swap one for another, which is just crazy. There's no feeling for what it's actually worth, a mature tree. And recent national planning guidance makes it really difficult to refuse a planning application as we're in the middle of a housing crisis. So I'd say that that's our biggest challenge in the face of climate change, is the politics and personal agendas of politicians, especially local politicians. Right, I'm sure we'll get onto that a bit later as well. So how are we doing for time?
5 minutes.
Oh, I'll hand over to you.
Okay.
More than 4 minutes.
I'll speak quickly. Actually, this was Orsa's last slide, and it's a very controversial active travel cycleway in the city. And as Orsa said, the politics are that cycleways rule no matter what. And it's resulted in the loss of many trees along Saffron Lane. That, with better design, could have been saved. So there's a lot of anger about that. So going into my official series of slides, I did want to actually say a big plus for engineers. We can work well with engineers. And the picture on the left, these are really recently planted city centre trees. We had the first lot of engineers who said you cannot plant anything anywhere. There's so many utilities. And actually we worked with an engineer who was enthusiastic, and he achieved 4 street trees in one of the city centre streets. And he admitted that a lot of engineers take the easy way out, but you can do it, and you can do it well. So when I started at Leicester City Council about 14 years ago, there was a huge programme called Plant 10,000 New Trees. These 3 trees were part of that programme. I will tell you, and I'm ashamed to say it, we used to plant trees in manhole rings. We used to plant them in 1.5 metre diameter manhole rings. They're still living, but it was all about this tick box. It wasn't about the long-term health. We're doing things differently now. I've talked to lots of people and had lots of arguments about putting plastic in the ground. I think the benefits are apparent. That tree on the right there is in one of our major radial routes just outside the city centre. I think I'm a year out. I think it's 3 years old, but that's in a crate system. And, you know, it looks magnificent already. And we know, we hope we know, that we won't have to dig the pavement up or other problems that may affect traditionally trees in the city centre. These are some of the trees we got in last year. One of the things we used to do is we had about 3 tree species we used everywhere: Carpinus, Betulus, Franz Fontaine, Tilia Brabant, and the other Tilia that I've forgotten, but there were just about 3 or 4 species we used everywhere. So one of the things we're trying to do now is vary the species we use, recognising their susceptibility to different climates. And one of the most successful trees we found are the Gleditzias, who seem to be happy close to very busy trafficked areas. So we've talked about heat, but we also want to talk about rain. We're having these heavy rain periods. This was Leicester 2 years ago in the summer. So it's this different weather patterns. We're one of the 10 principal urban areas most at risk from surface water flooding. So we have to take it seriously in Leicester. I've put these other things on the left. There's some that I'm going to skip through very quickly, but there's some of the drivers that, as also said, are pushing for trees, 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 new trees all the time. And what we're trying to push back on is please value our more mature stock, and let's look after that first before we start planting more and more vulnerable trees. So just a quick one about suds. 10 years ago, the picture on the left, this was our first experiment, both in using crates and using the suds plus gabions we used between the crates. Sorry, because suddenly paying for crates was a big shock over the cost of a manhole ring. So each of those trees sits in a crate, but between them there are gabions, and the surface water goes in, travels down, and is eventually picked up by the main system. This was our first experiment in crates and the first experiment of suds in a hard landscape setting. About 2 left, yeah. And the one on the right is Mill Lane, which is in De Montfort University in the centre of the city. And we're really proud of this. This was a highway that divided the city, divided the university into just a series of buildings that a city centre university didn't hang together. And we were able to work with the university, and then we eventually pulled in consultants to design this scheme, which is a series of interconnected rain gardens. So we've got different sorts of trees in there. We actually hold 2.5 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of rainwater before that water hits the River Soar, which would then hit more vulnerable communities north of the city. So we're now doing this more as our norm in the city. But I said about valuing the mature. We're not going to have time to talk about this, but Pine Tree Avenue is on the right-hand side, a glorious avenue. They're not pine trees, but it's a glorious avenue that in terms of historic conservation, in terms of amenity, in terms of the team that I work with, tends to have a value. In terms of Orsa's work, it's an endless headache, and it is constantly coming to the fore, and we're fighting to save it. I just put the photo in the top left because the consultants often don't value the things we've got in the city. And in the middle of our city, we've got a strawberry tree, and I made sure we saved that. I'll just say that sadly, following COVID, we tried to welcome people back to the city with trees in boxes. This costs a phenomenal amount, both in terms of time, in terms of water, utterly unsustainable. And it's given us a real headache because developers are now telling us, you plant trees in boxes, why can't we? We don't want trees in boxes. So nearly finished. This is carrying on the sort of principle of Mill Lane with rain gardens, but also planting trees down the middle of a highway. And Arthur and I worked out a whole series of trees using different trees that we might not normally use. And sadly, they got a bit watered down, but we'll still battle to have that variety. Street trees, penultimate slide. It's really difficult to get things on streets. And actually, locally in East Midlands, we've got an AGM on Thursday called The Pressure on the Streets, where we're looking at the challenges to accommodate suds, cycle lanes, trees, you name it, all on the same narrow corridors, really difficult. So what we're doing in our larger, not sustainable urban extensions, but whatever they're called now, is that we're planting our street trees in people's gardens. The problems there is that you don't have protection for them, but so far so good, and it is working, and really it's the only space left. So what are my key lessons, or what are our key lessons? Think about trees in advance. I get really annoyed with developers who say there's no space for trees. Hold on, you put those services in. You didn't talk to your landscape architect, your tree people. Make the space for trees at the beginning. It can be done. Work with trees and woodlands, but also all the disciplines. We need to respect each other. Engineers are incredibly creative, able people if you work with them. So I don't want people to kind of butt heads. I want us to work together. And we are beginning to change attitudes in the city and with the consultants we work with. I would recommend extending the range of what we plant wherever possible and plant them better. Thank you.
So thank you for having me here today. I'm going to talk about two ongoing projects that sit within this continuous interchange between trees and climate or the environment where they are. It seems like looking at the program, my two research focus, it's kind of in between what was and what's coming. So hopefully it will be fitting in all right with everyone. So Emma already touched upon that, but I'll focus on the tree or green area mostly. Obviously there is interchange between the environment and any surfaces. There is always incoming solar radiation, long wave being emitted, and any surface will reflect some of that away depending on its color, and will also emit long wave radiation depending on its temperature and sensible heat if it's hotter than the environment around it. But when we have a tree or a green area instead of a very man-made material, especially the very dark ones, then we'll have more reflected solar radiation, so they don't tend to absorb as much. They also use a lot of the temperature they get for the photosynthesis, and then through that they are able to evapotranspire water vapor, which won't heat up the environment around it. So it's not so much a cooling mechanism, it's just not a heating mechanism, but we identify it as a cooling benefits to having trees and green areas. Trees also can shade a lot of the surfaces around them, so the other surfaces won't heat as much. And that's why in many the green areas tend to be cooler than man-made areas. And this is particularly important in urban areas, and Emma already said, I'm not going in much detail, but as we know, the urban heat island is a big issue. And for instance, there are studies out there showing 7 or 10 degrees difference between city centers and the surroundings. I'm sure there are now newer studies showing higher differences. probably. And this has a serious implication for human health. There are studies showing that for every 1 degree increase in air temperature above 21, heat-related deaths increase by 3%. And that is mostly on the most vulnerable. So the very young, the very old, or the ones that have other health issues. So those people need to be protected somehow. We also know that with climate change, this is just going to be a major issue. So in 2014, a study showed that there was about 2,000 heat stress related deaths. And by the mid-century, we are expecting this to more than double. So this is an issue that is becoming quite considerably known. And the trees and green areas in cities can help with can be part of the solution. So our group started to try to see how much green infrastructure and trees can cool the environment and how much benefit they can get. We started by looking at green spaces and especially focusing on the night cooling. And we identified that they do have a significant effect. The larger the green space, the better. However, we were told by city planners that is all very nice, but obviously we don't have the area to go and put all these green spaces in our cities. So that's why we started to look at street trees, because that's where you can really impact the residents around them without taking too much space. And as I said, they provide water vapor transpiration, and they also shade, so they can improve thermal comfort of those passing around there or living around them. This is mainly during the daytime, which obviously it doesn't completely correspond to when the urban heat island is highest, but it still has a very good effect and can improve how they feel during the day and so on. They don't feel as stressed during the night. We obviously know that trees have a benefit, but most of the research has been done in very hot climates, and there is not much evidence showcasing by how much our British trees can cool the environment. So that's where we started. We started by putting sensors around 4 different places in Bristol because we had good connections there. And we got a street with trees compared to the closest street without trees we could find. Obviously, this in cities is quite hard to find the exact copy, but we were able to find some similarities in 4 different areas. And we have sensors taking the temperature of the street with trees compared to the one without trees since 2019. And just to showcase what happened when it was very hot, the last summer, the red lines, it's quite possible to read, but the red lines are the streets without trees, and the green lines are the ones with trees. And especially in the last 2 areas, you can see even on a big scale that they are cooling the streets, especially during the daytime when it's very hot. And coming back where it got very, very hot, where in Bristol, the temperatures almost got to 40 degrees as well. And again, you can see clearly that the trees in green, the streets with trees, the 2 green ones, are cooler than the ones above the yellow and the red. And this is from 2.5 degrees to 5 degrees, almost 5 degrees. So if anyone needs the evidence to be convinced, I think 5 degrees is quite convincing. We are now in the process of analyzing the data a little bit more, and then we will look at how the species can vary in terms of their cooling ability, what is transpiration versus what is shading, and so on. So we are hoping to go a bit deeper on this. And this brings me to a second project. We are working on the other side of the relationship. So how can the environment influence trees, especially in terms of their survival rates and their growth? And picking up on the last presentation, trees you all are aware that trees in urban areas are planted in very stressful environments, and the climate change is just going to intensify this, not just because it's going to bring less water, higher temperature, but as well pests and diseases that they might not be able to fight. So this is why, especially in terms of the pests and diseases, it's very important to diversify the tree species that are in urban forests, so the whole city. Because as we saw with the ash dieback disease or the elm beforehand, in a few decades ago, if we have too much emphasis in one species, then if that species is attacked, then a large proportion of our trees are dead. So diversifying and especially picking species that are going to withstand what is coming is very important. Because only when trees are grown, they are going to give the benefits that we need.
Through local surveyors direct for a ecology or biodiversity assessment.
Okay. Obviously, when you're a tree officer and the resources are low, you might not feel so inclined to go and trial new species you're not used to plant. And also nurseries probably won't have the stock for species that aren't particularly known. So that's why we started by basically recording how these new underused species that are already starting to be planted, but in low numbers, are growing and developing and surviving, so that we can share that information with others that may not be so inclined to try it. And also so that these people can go to whoever is saying, oh, maybe we should focus on natives and so on, the evidence that they need to showcase that we need to diversify.
You've got muted. Hello, you're muted, Maddie.
I'm just glad it wasn't my fault.
No.
It's entirely our fault. So we are doing this by, we worked with, we talked with some tree officers in London because they do have the resources to start trying new species in most cases and quite proactive. So we started by talking with Camden, and through their database of the species they were planting in the previous 5 years. So we started in 2018. So those that they planted from 2015 to there. We went through their species list and we picked some that we would like to follow. And then we added Hackney and a little area in Elephant and Castle. So these are the trees that we are following at the moment. It's about 200, I think, from 29 different species. And you won't find the typical ones that you probably get acquainted in urban areas, so limes and acers and oaks and so on are not included in this list. Obviously, we have to go with what they have, what they are planted, because we need a good replication. We started by trying to have 6 to 10 trees for each species. Obviously, we had some losses, so we are down on some species, but yeah. And just to showcase some of the trees we are following, you can see from the images that the canopies really are different, and some are doing better than others automatically. So as I mentioned, we did have some losses, especially in 2021. For instance, Serfidilium, which is Katsura, and Cercis canadiensis, the Judas trees, we lost at least half of the population we are following. So we are wondering, is this because it was hot? Is this because there was COVID and the trees weren't watering? So we are in conversations with the tree officers to see what are the aspects, the factors that led to these big deaths in 2021. The things we are measuring when we go there are basic biometric measurements, so the diameter, height, ground wave. Also, we are judging how good the canopy is, and also we are just taking some information on the landscape around it, so that we can then put that in our statistical approach. And most of the trees were surveyed twice, and the Camden trees were already surveyed 3 times, and we are hoping to go there back again this summer. But you already can see the rate that the trees are growing, and especially that it really differs from species to species. Obviously, tree species will grow at different rates, so that doesn't mean that they are doing better than others, but obviously adding that to the survival rates, then you can have a true picture of what works and what doesn't. So you can see, for instance, the hybrid elm almost is doing very well. Softwood japonica is doing very well. Liriodendro is in some cases doing well, but trees that aren't doing well are the Katsura tree, Serpodilium euonymus europaeus, which is actually a native. And the mammalis, I didn't put it even in this figure because we are down to 2 trees, I think, from the 6 or 7 that we had. I have to say these figures just include the ones that are still alive. So any that are dead were removed, so that doesn't influence the growth. The same for height. Some are doing very well, but for instance, Katsura tree is actually diminishing the height. Obviously, this might be because it was pruned, but it might be because of dieback. So we have to see how they are doing. The ones that are alive still. How are they doing this summer, if they're still alive? And the same for crown wave. Again, some are doing very well, some are receding their crown wave. Just so to conclude, this work is still ongoing, but we are confident we can say and promote that cooling by urban trees is present when needed the most. So yeah, the more trees, the better, especially the mature ones, which give you the most benefits. But obviously, we understand that this will vary from species to species, canopy size, how the trees are planted, and also the street and building design, the direction of the streets, the topography, and so on. So these factors will start digging out on these factors in next years. And in terms of the other projects, it's quite evident that we need to diversify our tree species pool in urban areas, and also we need to pick those that will probably tolerate what happens in 30 years' time when they are starting to give the type of benefits we want from them. And this study is just obviously tree officers kind of anecdotally know the information we are collecting, but we are just giving the numbers to help support others that may be a bit more scared about using it, or even to showcase to people that don't know how the trees would grow. And so far we have initial trends, but it's quite clear that some trees are growing more vigorously than others. So Humus dotwens, Fura japonica, Belter paniculata, Ligeodian tulipifera, and Morus album are doing very well, especially compared with Amamelis cerfidilium and Euonymus europaea. And that is me for now. Thank you very much. And yeah, if especially tree officers are interested in participating in this study, please contact me. We are still expanding our the pool, so yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really great to be here. Thanks for having us, TDAG, and everyone else involved. It's really nice to kind of look around the room and see some familiar faces and have an in-person event after all this COVID rubbish. So yeah, we're gonna have a quick chat about what do warmer temperatures mean for trees, heat tolerance. I'm going to introduce Chris, who is our summer student at Bartlett's, research summer student. Where am I this morning? Research assistant at Bartlett's. Chris has come on full time with us, and it's great to have him involved in some of our research. And this is a project that he's been basically running for the last year or so, looking at heat tolerance. Yep, if I can make the slide work, we're on this, aren't we? Don't use the keyboards. Use the big arrow. There we go. Make the computers work. Sorry for the technology problems. So as many of us have done earlier in the day, we're showing this graph of incrementally increasing temperatures, and global warming is causing this, and it results in some really unpleasant things. I mean, none of us, I'm sure, particularly like when it's 40, or I certainly don't like when it's 40 degrees in the countryside or underneath the Stevenson's green in the shade. That's really not a pleasant environment. But what's potentially even worse is going onto a train and seeing a man dressed like this. So, you know, the trees don't like it, we don't like it, and we especially don't like it when we get on the train like this. So like I say, the trees don't like it, and trying to look at differentiating heat stress and drought stress as kind of what these pictures are hopefully showing, that the heat stress here just causing this peripheral burn, the external burn of a plant here, and the drought stress, obviously you put your soil moisture in the ground if you can actually get it in the baked dry ground. And in this case, our very fancy scientific soil moisture sensor that cost far too much money just says it's too dry. So that was a revelation in scientific instrumentation there. Great soil moisture sensor, actually. Delta T makes some fantastic sensors, but yeah, in this case, 0 is definitely too dry. So I'm going to try and kind of introduce us to a bit of heat and drought here, and then pass over to Chris, who will talk about his heat stress trial, and we'll kind of see hopefully how these kind of interlink through that. So I've got a nice picture that took far too long to take of stomata on the underside of a leaf surface. Hopefully they look familiar to some of you in the room and online as well. And just looking at how heat and drought typically come together as a single stress. Often in the urban environment, we're seeing lots more heat, but drought as well. So why am I talking, or why are we talking today about separating them out? Why are we talking about heat on its own potentially? And we're getting, we're potentially getting more heat stress as we reduce the water content in the leaves. So when there's less water, the leaf temperatures are allowed to fluctuate. It's one method of measuring drought effects, as you start seeing the leaves warm up because they're losing their water in there. So as those leaves are losing their water, they're also increasing the stress. They're losing water, they're drought stressed, but they're also having a greater heat stress effect as well. And kind of similar to humans, we sweat, so we cool down. The trees are essentially sweating to cool down, but if they don't have enough water, then they're not cooling down sufficiently, so we get more heat stress. So what can we do about this? We're often talking about silver bullets and what's the solution. Don't give me problems, give me solutions is a problem I'm increasingly wanting to say. And the solution is just to plant the trees that are more heat stressed, that are more adapted to the hot environments. And maybe in this case, that might be something that you don't want to do. You don't want to have a bunch of agave plants instead of a bunch of poplar plants. But there's some fine tuning we can do in this to keep the aesthetic that we want, as well as selecting for that heat stress. In Bartlett's, we also look at what some people might call muck and magic projects. We look at lots of different products that we can apply to trees as well. So someone earlier said we need big trees, and the best thing you can do to get big trees in your urban environments is to keep them. It's a really great line, actually, and a really simple sounding solution. But one solution for that, potentially if you've got maybe a tree that's struggling in an area, is to look at applying some products to help that tree grow to its best in the environment. So some things we're looking at in Bartlett's are some of these externally applied products. But in this case, we're talking about tree selection. So maybe that's another talk for another day. So don't everyone all run out of the room because I put a complicated figure up. This is just a kind of overview of some of the things that might happen to a plant in response to heat, to kind of discuss this separate stress of heat separated from drought. So we've got the heat shock factors, heat shock proteins responding in the middle of the graph, one of the red big circles there. But also notice the drought responsive element binding proteins. That's all the science words that you're going to get out of me, but there are these two separate pathways essentially going on that you can see are interlinked, but also separated essentially. So they do overlap, and I think that's important to remember. So it's already been mentioned, but obviously Andy's put in a lot of work into the species selection guides, and that's based on some fantastic scientific data. So essentially allows me to say that the drought tolerance is relatively easy nowadays to measure. We can have some arguments about how and where we measure, but it's relatively easy now to say whether it's a drought tolerant plant or a not drought tolerant plant. But heat tolerance still kind of isn't in that selection guide, and it would be really nice to potentially introduce it as a kind of combined factor, combine it together with that. And that's difficult because it's still very difficult to measure heat tolerance. We don't have that kind of Turger loss point that Andy talks, and many of you will be familiar that Andy's talked about, that allows us to select for drought tolerance. So that's something that Chris is going to talk about in a second, but I just wanted to jump in before I pass over to Chris and just kind of remind that we do have these pest and disease problems that come in more severity. It's nice to hear again earlier that we're seeing other pests and diseases and changes in pests and diseases in response to this stress. So really worth kind of looking out for and being aware. And I think in the UK, we really need to familiarize ourselves more with pests and diseases, and maybe consider taking some treatments to control those pests and diseases. Because as we were saying, the ecological benefit of having a tree there far outweighs the potential for it maybe being a native or not native. If you've got a tree there, that's the main thing. You know, the solution to oak processionary moth is chop down all oak trees, but we really don't want to do that. So we might need to come in and apply some treatments to control a caterpillar infestation in that example. So pass over to Chris.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a trial we ran over the summer of last year. Initially, we wanted to look at if we can select more heat-tolerant plants from a native species, such as the English oak, based on its kind of location across the UK. The hypothesis was that acorns we collected from colder areas, such as like the north of Scotland, would be more heat sensitive than acorns we collected from warmer areas in the south of England. So a couple of years ago, we managed to gather acorns from about 16 different locations. We took 10 plants from each location last year, put them in a randomized block, and put them into this polytunnel. A little bit of background information. Critical temperature is the temperature at which photosynthetic efficiency begins to decrease. This indicates that the heat is denaturing the thylakoid membranes, causing the photosynthetic electric transport chain to break down. This is usually around 42 degrees, but it varies largely depending on the species, if the plants have had any other products applied to them, if they've had a sufficient amount of time to acclimate to the heat, or if there are any other stresses affecting the plant. So chlorophyll fluorescence is used to measure photosynthetic efficiency. We use this kind of widely along with SPAD or chlorophyll content to gauge the vitality of plants. And as these are the systems that are affected first by heat stress, it makes it an ideal method to monitor the plants over time. So this has already been covered, but last summer was very hot. 19th of July was the hottest on record in the UK. And in addition to the already pleasant weather we were enjoying that day, myself and a lucky summer student got to go into these tunnels and squat over these plants for several hours in temperatures that were exceeding the Sahara Desert at the time. So we measured the plants twice during the day, once in the morning when it was cooler, and then once again in the afternoon when the temperature reached its peak. And we saw that even in this brief time period, the photosynthetic efficiency decreased by quite a large margin. We then repeated a similar experiment in the labs. Unfortunately, some plants did expire due to the heat. So we had 12 locations for this trial. But we took leaves off the plants and we cut out leaf discs from the leaves. We placed them in a 50-degree water bath to hopefully induce a heat stress, but not a drought stress. Although this is less inclusive than measuring on the plants in an extreme heat condition, it is easily repeatable and non-destructive to the plants. So we can see that on the table at 0 hours at the beginning of the trial, there's no significant difference between photosynthetic efficiency between the different locations. But after 4 hours in the heat, they've begun to split into two groups, A and B, A being significantly more heat tolerant and B being more significantly heat sensitive. AB in the middle is not significantly related to or significantly different from either group. And then again, from when we measured in the tunnel, we saw a very similar thing, no significant difference in the morning, but then in the afternoon, they're split into two different groups. Unfortunately, in neither trial did we see a significant relationship to latitude or longitude, or from warmer to colder areas of the UK. But fortunately, we did find that the two methods did correlate well with each other, meaning that we can use the laboratory method as a rapid kind of screening process for heat tolerance. So in conclusion, we'd very much like to continue this trial, like over the next couple of years, if we could collect acorns from a lot more different locations. We can try and find out kind of why there was a difference between heat tolerance in some of the locations, whether it's just random or whether there are any other factors, which brings us on to how you can help us. So we would love some people this autumn to kind of gather some acorns for us and send them to us. You can get some more information on that by emailing me at c+.barlow.com. Then also, if anyone knows any students that would like a job over the summer, we have some placements.
Thank you very much.
I should say that, yeah, as well as being here as part of my activity with Myosco, it's also great to announce the Urban Plant Institute, which is a group that's got a very small core team at the moment, myself and Henrik Holman and Professor Hitchmore, who will be focusing on delivering really good quality guidance for urban environments around planting. So look out for more information on that in the near future. Thought I'd start with a very scenic shot of Preston. Preston often gets a bit of a bad rep, but look how beautiful it is. So these headlines are familiar to us if you keep a track of such things. Plenty of evidence in the public facing newspapers and so on that we're beginning to really take note of the heat waves and drought within this country. And today, no different. Coronation heat. I don't normally read the Daily Star, I should add, but I did just note the newspaper headline today, coronation heat. So we're up for a bit more heat in next weekend, I guess. Okay, the consequences then. Well, this was a report of Gloucester City Council last year, where more than 12,000 trees planted across the city died in the summer heat wave. Not particularly good headlines, I'm sure, for those involved, but to be fair, it could have been any number of city councils across the UK. Last year was very, very hot, and it caused a lot of damage, particularly to new plantings. I think if I was writing the headline, I might have said lack of aftercare kills 12,000 trees planted in Gloucester. Now, maybe that's being slightly unfair, but you get the point. Actually, it's a combination of the climate that we're facing, but also the problems in our policies when it comes to managing newly planted trees. And I think when it comes to selection, it's really critical that we're involved with the drivers of tree mortality. And this is a really recent review published in Nature that looks at the importance of some of these mechanisms, including drought, increasing CO2, and increasing vapor pressure deficit, which integrates the relative humidity in the air temperature. So we're expecting more of that, higher vapor pressure deficits with higher heat. And I won't unpick this. We haven't got a great deal of time today, but suffice to say there are some external drivers of tree mortality as well as some internal drivers. And if we just look at some of those external drivers, things like rising temperature and VPD, suboptimal fertility, poor water access, prior droughts. Actually, what we're describing is urban trees, isn't it? Urban situations. And in fact, you can also look at the internal aspects, so the vulnerability to embolism and the high turgor loss point. They're characteristics that are inherent within the species that can help us evaluate their resilience to stress and heat and drought in particular. I could also add shade and prior biotic attacks in there as being important in urban environments, and structural damage, of course, caused by high pruning cycles. So actually, when you look at those things that are driving tree mortality and you combine that with the urban environment, we are really placing trees into a stressful situation. And this is the sort of context which we can often see, this sort of plaza, impermeable surfacing, lots of reflected heat and lots of heat that's absorbed by hard surfaces in the area. So those sorts of contexts are really challenging for us to place trees into. And here we can look at some of those responses that trees have to heat and extreme heat events. And they can be looked at, if you like, at the whole tree level, a leaf level and a cellular level. And Chris and John pointed to some of those mechanistic problems with the photosystem 2 functioning and so on, and some of those heat stress expressions of heat stress proteins and so on. But at a larger level, the stuff that we see growth being negatively affected, mortality increasing, leaf shedding increasing, leaf area development tends to be lower. And so, there's some good reviews on critical responses to trees that we can use to help inform our decisions as well. And so trees cope with heat in a variety of ways. Heat shock proteins are important. That is potentially something you could screen for, but to screen for the hundreds of species across that we want to use across our urban environments would be really labor intensive. Not impossible, quite easily achieved, but frankly, the funding bodies don't seem to want to fund that sort of work. And there's a whole range of other proteins and compounds that have been implicated in heat tolerance, proline, abscisic acid, salicylic acid, and these are things that you could look at a species level. And there's been quite a lot of work done on biogenic volatile organic compounds, BVOCs, particularly because that also relates to air quality. And some species are known to emit these to a greater extent than other species. The background image there is of the Blue Mountains in New South Wales. And of course, they're called the Blue Mountains because of those BVOCs that create this haze in the heat. I think one of the things that is really important to acknowledge is that trees don't ever experience a single stress. They experience complex stresses. And so heat in the real world is very difficult to separate from drought. They often occur together. And of course, the climate and the soil is also really, really important. This was taken in Snowdonia in 2018, that dry period got mentioned earlier, actually. And you can see here that the oak trees on this sort of escarpment that are on the shallowest soil have died, or perhaps they haven't died, but they're certainly suffering a great deal. Whereas those that are either higher up on that escarpment, slightly deeper soil, and those that are, if you like, on the field margins below that have access to large soil volumes are still green. Whereas those that are in the most compromising of sites have turned dry and have hydraulically failed. You can see that in the fact that they got brown leaves. So we have to think about these things as complex interactions of stresses. This was a recent paper in Nature looking at climate change and increases in global risk to urban forests. Some of you may well have come across it, and you can see the projected changes of a number of cities there. And Europe is looking at projected changes. Of course, it ranges, but in excess of 2 degrees. And we've seen that can be really problematic for a number of reasons. Other parts of the world, you can see in North America, some cities there that are in the study, temperature changes projected to be in excess of 4 degrees. And so if we just take mean annual temperature, we can see actually that the proportion of species currently exceeding their safety margin, can be very, very high. And I can't go into the methodology. You can look that up in your own time. But effectively, they've taken the inventory of street trees and trees within the city. They provided a safety margin to that mean annual temperature figure based on the climatic data. And you can see that the current situation is quite bad, but that right-hand image there shows the projected issue in 2050. And you can see all the red there. So that's, 60, 80, 100% of the species in those cities projected to be outside of their safety margin. In other words, we can expect our urban trees to be under extreme stress going forward. So that is quite a sobering thought. And of course, we've only got to look at the sort of satellite that we got from last year here in the UK to see that, large portions of our nation are likely to be affected severely by these sorts of heat waves. But we have 73,000, give or take, trees to be selecting from. So surely we can do something. I'd just like to talk very, very quickly, because we are constrained for time, about 3 different approaches. So there's a trait-based assessment that I think is really important, and that's really informed lots of the TDAG allocations to drought tolerance and so on. There's the value of biogeographical data analysis and species distribution models and ecophysiology. I think they're, if you like, 3 strands that can help inform our future selection. So the sorts of traits that we might use, we can evaluate the loss of conductivity within the xylem as something called embolism occurs. So just like if you get an air bubble in your veins, that's generally not good for your health. Every air bubble that spreads within a vessel element or a tracheid reduces the amount of water that can flow through a stem. So you can see that right-hand image, bottom right there. The dark vessels are those that are filled with air. So as the stress progresses, more and more of those vessels get full of air, and less of those vessels are able to conduct water. And we can measure these things physiologically. And so, for example, 50% loss of conductivity in the case of this acidophyllum here, it occurs just past a measure called water potential at -2 megapascals. And so that allowed us, was one of the traits that allowed us to say, well, that species is sensitive to drought within the TDAG guide. But another species, Eucomia omoides here, we evaluated, and that was, approaching -4 megapascals. Now, these are really meaningful difference physiologically speaking, and that enabled us, or was one of the drivers that enabled us to say that that species was tolerant to drought. So we can use these sorts of traits to guide our selection decision, and it was great to see there might be some other traits coming from John and Chris's work there that we can look to specifically evaluate the heat tolerance. And of course, the consequences of loss of conductivity is that the crown starts to decline and retrench as the hydraulic pathways get shorter and shorter, and the tree just tries to cling on to life. So if you've seen trees like this in your urban environment, then actually what you're seeing is an expression of that loss of conductivity within the xylem itself. And we've also done quite a lot of work on the leaf turgor point, and I'm sure many of you have seen me speak about that in the past, and we're able to say, well, okay, at a certain level, we've got we're going to call that sensitive to drought, then moderately sensitive, moderately tolerant, and tolerant to drought, so that we can, if you like, provide a qualitative statement that is supported by evidence behind the scenes. And that is quite a lot of work that particularly Henrik Harman and myself have done over the last few years, but people like Harry and various others have been involved with that as well. And most recently, we looked at the difference between trees and shrubs, and you see they have a pretty similar spread in terms of where their mean turgor loss is. It's quite similar, around -2.6, -2.7 megapascals. But you can see that the really drought tolerant species have a turgor loss point of less than -4 megapascals. So these are really, as I say, profound differences we can evaluate physiologically. And that's the paper that came out in Hort Science a couple of weeks ago. So biogeographically then, let's just take a really quick case study on elms that I should really give Harry a nod. He's the guy that does a lot of this climate modeling work. He's going to be speaking in a moment, but on a slightly different subject. So I want to flag up some of this work as being really of value. So we can take the distribution of ulmus, and we have databases that record their climate and their geographical distribution. And then what we can do is we can project those distributions on a climate model that looks, for example, at warmth index. The x-axis is warmth index, and the y-axis in this case is annual rainfall. And you can see that those distributions vary according to species. Some are much more focused around, if you like, warmer climates. Some clearly prefer higher rainfall areas, and so on. And I can't unpack this a great deal, but actually we can use this sort of analysis to help inform our species selection. And from a really exciting perspective, we can use this analysis to help guide where we collect future species from or future ecotypes. So it might be that we have the species in production, but it's not of a particularly suitable ecotype for future scenarios. And on this, you might just about be able to make out that you can project the city that you're in or the region you're in. And so you can see, well, if I'm in London or Barcelona, whereabouts in the world should I be looking to collect this species from to best match it to our climate? So that's all possible with biogeographical analysis. And then finally, I just wanted to give a really quick shout out to a project that's I'm involved with at the moment, the Tree Production Innovation Fund. It's mostly around water use in tree nurseries. But this is just some data looking at the sap flux density. So the blue is the sap flux, so that's how fast the sap's flowing. The purple is the growth. You can see here the early part of the season in this Pyrus Caleriana, water is relatively well available and it's growing quite nicely. And as we get towards July, the water supply becomes more constrained, and actually the dendrometer data picking up the growth becomes much more noisy because the tree starts to shrink on a daily basis as its root system can't supply the transpiration stream. And in fact, at this point here, between those two heat waves, you can see the whole tree is shrinking rather than growing. And then as soon as we get that break of the second heat wave, you might remember we've got rainfall coming along, we get much less noise in that growth data as the tree is able to recover. So we can use this sort of data to understand species responses to heat, drought, the conditions, and it's really exciting when you have data like this that's at 10-minute resolution. You can tell an awful lot about how a tree responds to its environment. So thanks for listening.
Afternoon, everyone, and good to see you. Just picking up on this question then of thermal tolerance, climate change. I've been really interested in the questions that we've been talking about this morning. And what I wanted to do just now is perhaps look at the cumulative impact of some of these decisions that we take when we think about species selection and planting, because it's very difficult to get a perspective on how our green infrastructure systems are changing if on a day-to-day basis, on a project-to-project basis, we are trying to study a site and make decisions about that site and thinking about the characteristics of that particular place. And I wanted to kind of zoom back a few steps and then kind of create a picture of where we are. So this is, from our perspective in St Andrews, we look at this map a lot and we think about the Botanic Garden and what its role could be, thinking about kind of advising other organisations, boroughs, local authorities, designers on what's going to work and what isn't. It looks like we're going to be in Brittany in a few years' time, which in some ways is really challenging, but sometimes some ways really exciting. Like when you go to Brittany, there are fantastic huge oaks growing there, and it's very hard in a way to kind of get that picture of kind of optimism and kind of just existential panic reconciled in the same decision-making process. This is a graph that is similar to the one that Andy showed a few seconds ago. It's this niche analysis tool, really, when we look at biogeographical studies. And what we wanted to do here, this is a paper that I worked on with Henrik a couple of years ago, when we asked, where are all our urban trees come from? And we got in touch with a lot of nurseries across Northern Europe. And we started to look at five or six species in particular and think about what are those climate niches? And what do those climate niches mean that those species occupy in relation to where we're planting the trees? And if you just focus on the grey dots at the moment, if we picked out there London and Berlin, at the moment, London and Berlin are on the edge, basically, of hornbeams or Carpinus speculus's kind of natural range. It's kind of comfortable area. Doesn't take long before you start to see in 30 years' time, London and Berlin move well outside of that comfort zone. That's not to say that hornbeams won't grow in these conditions, but we're starting to push the boundaries of what these trees will tolerate. And it's when you start to push these boundaries, that's when the accidents really start to happen. Gleditsia was a really interesting example that was brought up earlier. I remember seeing that a lot in the streets of Cadiz, southern Spain. And it's kind of wild in a way, now seeing that planted and being very successful in London, East Anglia, Leicestershire. And I think as you start to look at this picture, the question is not so much about like, what's most comfortable for a tree, but like, what can you handle? How far can you push a tree before it keels over? So I wanted to then start to look at this from the perspective of pests and diseases, because it's when you start to go across these margins that the impact of P&D really start to play a big role. And these are two pieces of research we did through over the last couple of years through the Plant Health Centre in Scotland. And what we did is we looked at the designs that designers produce and get approved through the planning process. And then we went along and kind of harvested lots and lots of species information off the planting proposals. And then we went to site and looked at what's planted and the differences between what's planted and what's in the plans. And it's trying to build this picture of the cumulative decision, the cumulative impacts of the decisions that we take as designers, as local authorities. And in many ways, having worked in consultancy for a long time, you know, you have a sense in the industry that not always what you plant ends up on site. I was kind of astonished to see quite how big that kind of picture actually expands to. We found the large majority of schemes aren't delivered as the local authority approves them, which means that we have developers across the country, Scotland and England, who routinely create housing developments, for example. I don't want to single out a particular area of the sector, for example, but who routinely deliver schemes that are not what the local authority expects. And so if we then start to look at the implications of this in different directions, it could be in policy, it could be in biodiversity net gain, it could be in kind of tree planting targets, the kinds of decisions then that politicians are able to take, for example, are based on really faulty information, because a lot of the tree planting targets are based on what local authorities think they're approving, but because of, you know, the resource availability, people aren't able to do enforcement, going to do like snagging in the same way that we might hope. Sometimes it means that very often there's a game being played. And this is the consequence. We see like a narrow, very narrow species selection being used by landscape architects very often. And again, putting that into a context of kind of what's this look like across Scotland and England is really scary. We've, you know, through conversations with nurseries, have been talking about like, what will it take for you to be able to confidently produce large volumes of these diverse species that we want to be seeing? And there's a lot of risk that has to be accommodated by a nursery if they're going to be trying to produce a wide range of species that we hope we will see in these diverse treescapes. So looking at this then from the pests perspective, as it were, looking at what green infrastructure looks like, it looks like it's kind of like open territory, like they've got a range of species that they know they're going to be very comfortable munching away on. And what can we do in response to that? Well, I think there's a few things we can do. First of all, is to think about pests and diseases, not just as this isolated group, kind of like existential panics, but they are part of this broader environmental microbiome. So pests and diseases are part of the natural environment. They're part of adaptive processes. The issue that we're facing is novelty, and I guess the exposure to stress that this novel pests operate within. This is a piece of work we did a couple of years ago now that was published, well, it took a long time to get through the peer review process, so it feels like it's still very recent in a way. But we've started to put together the kind of concerns that you might have as a landscape architect and the issues that you might be facing as an urban forester, and putting that into a context of like the plan of works that kind of regulates in a way the construction industry. So we all kind of feed into this plan of works in different ways. And so often when you look at that, it's a REBA document, so it's designed for architects and we all kind of play to their tune. And when you look at this kind of plan of works, it's very difficult sometimes to think about like how collaboration might actively happen from a civil engineer's perspective, or a quantity surveyor's perspective, mechanical and electrical engineer's perspective. And then when you start thinking about like, oh, you know, where does a microbial ecologist fit into this? You know, the developer is kind of like, well, good luck. So we wanted to be able to identify concrete strategies that would fit into the picture that a client would have, you know, as a developer. And so we started thinking about what does the landscape architect need to do and what do microbiologists do? And I'll just very quickly run through a couple of these things and then look at what the other side of the coin might be. So at the early stages, we really wanted to focus on communication. embedding this collaborative language is essential if we're going to start getting to grips with pests and diseases and all this novelty as quickly as possible, because we need to lean outside of our professions to get the advice that we need. Brief formation is a critical part of that. Having worked in project management in a couple of instances, in a couple of projects, it's been a journey in a way in seeing the impact that it can have to start talking about microbes at Reba stage 1 on the rest of the design team and people like architects and planners. Okay, can you point me in can you point me in the direction of a PCR sampler? Who can I talk to go and tell me about what is in the soil that we're using here? When it comes to design, and being anticipatory in terms of your design process is absolutely critical. This has lots of different touch points. It could be to do with contract growing for plants and trees in particular. It could be identifying which community groups are going to be most wanting to use a particular landscape at a particular time. And when it comes to planting and management, it's all about how do you ensure that the people who make the decisions and talk about like what should be planted where, the quantity surveyors who decide like what acceptable variations to contract might be, how does that kind of institutional memory carry through into management decisions? Because so often we see these back-to-back contracts breaking down or being changed where one person who plants a tree is over the horizon and a different management team comes in and looks after it. So that if you're able to find this article or want to know more about it, do get in touch with me, or you can find it on the internet in the journals. But do get in touch if you want to find it, because there's lots in there about how we can actually develop these kind of forms of communication and make sure that this information is carried through into the site. I wanted to look at the other side of the coin, lastly, in terms of like, what does it mean for a designer? Like all of these kind of questions, you kind of want to approach with a design hat on. And this is kind of like where, in a way, things can fall apart quite quickly. I don't know how many people interact with the Plant Health Risk Register, but it's a phenomenal, it's a living archive of information about all the pests and diseases that we anticipate being in the country or are in the country at the moment. And you've got this very helpful button here about download the CSV. When you download the CSV, this is what it looks like when I open it up on my computer and I scan right down to the bottom and see we've got 1,414 pests and diseases on DEFRA's radar. Now, this is super exciting, brilliant. There are lots of pests and diseases for us to think about. But look at those headlines. They are quite difficult to interact with. And when you start to look at like what the actual hosts are of these pests and diseases, I've pulled out some information here from 2 pests and diseases which are very kind of close to each other alphabetically, at least. Xylella, we all jump up and down about it. It's kind of like the celebrity pest and disease, and this is a celebrity bacterium in a way. But it just shows you when you start to interact with the Plant Health Risk Register how difficult it is for us as designers to interact with it and make sensible decisions. Because when you look at the hosts here, for example, there's species there are genera there. Some of them are, provoking all kinds of questions. Like, for example, I don't know, like let's pick out Acer, for example. Like, are we sure it's just those 2 Acer species that Xylella is going to be jumping up and down about? I imagine there are other Acers. If we look at Xylosandrus germanus, well, I'm not sure actually. Like, there's a whole range of different species in there as well. There's a really good risk rating assessment within the risk register for like mitigated risk levels and unmitigated risk levels, which start to incorporate the kind of actions we can take at policy levels, at, different stages along the continuum. So we've got here Xylella, 60, the highest I think is 125 as a pest rating. The scariest, I think there are 3 of those, including emerald ash borer and, well, I've tried, it's another massive one, words escape me right now. But if there are 3 P&D rated at 125, Xylella coming in at 60 is still a really scary pest. We DEFRA reckon it can come down to 30, but Xylosandrus germanus is still sitting there quite comfortably at 60 and 60, which suggests there's a lot that we need to be doing. I thought it'd be really interesting to write a bit of code that would act on this CSV file and think, what can we turn this into? If we're designers working with trees, how can we turn all of these potential hosts into something we can use for decision making? And it's really tricky because you can't go through this folder and kind of go, oh, I'm interested in planting some oaks. Which pests do I need to watch out for? So if we turn it around, we can produce these kind of like aggregated risk scores for different tree species and genera. And this is where I think it's really important that we kind of do this kind of work. It's not a robust piece of work. It's really a thumbnail sketch. It needs developing, but it's a way of getting around some of these blind spots that we have as designers. Because if we are scared about emerald ash borer, for example, we start getting really worried about fraxinus. But if we start to put fraxinus into this picture, we find it all the way down over here, coming at 756. And in fact, there's quite a few different prunus, roses, larches, spruces that we might need to be thinking a lot more carefully about from a design perspective. This has got a lot of work to be developed, but I think gives us perhaps a mechanism at least for interacting with pests and diseases, which is very often well beyond our kind of core specialisms as designers. I wanted to end with maybe 2 discussion points, and hopefully in the conversations afterwards we can explore these, because there's certainly lots that we can do at kind of policy levels, from local authority decision making, kind of like the local plan, so on, and the guidance that can come through. But these kinds of discussion points here that I picked out have been occupying my thought processes a lot over the last couple of years that perhaps we don't necessarily talk about so much. The first is to do with probability. As kind of like tree biologists, as physiologists, we talk about probability on a day-to-day basis. It's what we use in order to understand like what is robust and what isn't. But it's a very alien concept when it comes to decision-making processes in design. And being comfortable with probability is going to take a lot of work, I think, for us as a sector. This, I think, plays out in a couple of different ways. One is this kind of like the mantra that we have of like the right tree in the right place for the right purpose. I'm not sure we should be using that all the time, because we need to be talking in realms of possibility. What could be the best or one of the better species in one of the many sites in which I work over the course of the next 15 years or 40 years or 120 years. This is a really uncomfortable area for us, I think, to be talking about, but needs a lot of work in, because the realm of the uncertain is uncomfortable and really hard to pin down on. There are tools that we can use to become more comfortable with it, but I think that's got to be an interesting area for us to explore. The other discussion point is kind of like, if we've got all this novelty that we're confronted with and all of these threats interacting in different ways, the temptation is to kind of go, we need a new system. We need something which matches that novelty. We need something totally different. I'm not sure we necessarily do need something totally different in order to interact and manage this uncertainty or this novelty. I think we've got fantastic tools at our disposal, many of which we're not using in the ways in which they could be used. I picked out here like the Reba Planner Works. I think the Reba Planner Works is a really cool piece of work if it starts to incorporate collaboration, forward planning a lot more. It could be a lot more punchy. If we look at the Plant Health Risk Register, 1,414 P&D, wow, amazing. Lots for us there to get to grips with, but it's almost entirely inaccessible for any of us in a decision-making context. So there's work there that we can do to manipulate that into ways that are more accessible. BIM systems, I think the capacity to adapt or attach like data, like words, numbers to vectors, like the lines we draw in our CAD systems, is phenomenal. But not only in terms of the simple attachment of data to lines, but also the systems you use in BIM to do that are completely software agnostic. It's a CSV file. Anyone, whether you're in a nursery or as a quantity surveyor or a landscape manager, everyone uses Excel sheets all the time. So this could be a really powerful tool that we're not making the most of. And lastly, I guess as well, I didn't put it in there, but it's the planning system. Whenever we submit drawings for permission, for approval, I should say, to a local authority, we get our conditions back after we get approval, and it says things like submit a specification of plants you're going to use in a 5-year management plan. I'd love to see there a condition saying, and give us a 5-year biosecurity plan. That first condition I mentioned has driven almost all of the last landscape architecture profession. It's made all of us have work, basically, because our clients have to fulfill that condition. If we had another clause in there as a condition which said, tell us what you're going to do about pests and diseases over the course of the next 5 years, my word, I think we'd see a very different response coming through from developers and other types of clients. So I think there's lots that we can do at the moment in order to kind of interact and manage a lot of these threats, we just might need to think about how they can communicate with each other a little bit more. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks for having me. I do realise this is the dreadful after dinner lunch spot when people's eyes start to droop. So, and I've got far too many slides, so I'm going to whiz through them fairly quickly. I'm going to talk about the work that I'm involved with in Thamesmead in southeast London, a place that some people may have heard of, featuring in Clockwork Orange or Misfits or various other dystopian sort of scenarios, television and film scenarios. But a fascinating place, which I've been involved with Peabody for about 6 years. Just a little bit about Peabody. Peabody are one of the country's oldest housing associations, have been building homes in London for over 160 years, some of which they still manage and look after. And I think the key hint there is that we take a very long-term approach. Thamesmead is very unusual in their portfolio, and I'll talk about that as we whiz through. This is a bit about trees and a bit about green infrastructure, but in my view, the two are inextricably connected. Oh, that doesn't work. Oh, okay. Worked about 5 seconds ago.
So if you need to click on
yes, yeah. Oh, is it? Oh, even better, touchscreen. For those of you who don't know London or Thamesmead, it's towards the east of central London on the Thames, just east of Woolwich, which for some people is a mystery already, but going anywhere beyond there is even more mysterious. But it's a very large, very large area, which we have some control over now. And as you can see, it's big enough to fit central London into. So it's quite a huge sort of lump of London. And one of the things which makes it particularly unusual is that it was subject to a Greater London Council GLC master plan in the 60s to create a new town for London. And that new town was to deal with a housing crisis of the time, which wasn't about numbers, it was about housing conditions. Lots of people living in houses of multiple occupation, often without proper sanitation, etc. And the GLC vision for this part of London was to create a town for about 60,000 people, which was going to provide, you know, far better living conditions. And I always like this picture here, which was obviously taken very early days, the sort of extraordinary Dan Dare future in the background, some of which some people is a bit of a Marmite type architecture, and the sort of Edwardian pram in the foreground, which just shows this sort of extraordinary clash of cultures and timing and architecture and design and thinking about place of the era. Today, it's an area, a town of about 45,000 people, 16,000 households. We own just over and manage just over 5,000 of those. 7.5 square kilometres, and what makes it unusual is that we seem to have ended up owning about 65% of all of the area. So the area which isn't within our ownership is largely private housing in the States, built in the last decade, I guess. And as you can see from that aerial view, with the Thames just toward the top of the screen, it's quite green and unusual perhaps in that respect. Just a little bit about the work that we're doing. You know, we're actually coming to the end of our first 5-year plan, 2023, but we have some very clear goals which go forward over the next 3 decades at least. One is about making it a better place to live, one is about development, one is about landscape, which I'm going to talk a lot about, and then culture and community. We take a holistic approach to places. We think a whole place approach is important, and I think that's whether it's green infrastructure or how people live or whatever. So I just want to touch quickly on what I think of as our incredible green and blue assets, because that leads on to thinking about trees. We've got about 250 hectares of green space, parks, and an awful lot of water, not including the Thames, which I'll touch upon. Have 5 lakes. Anybody who was a fan of Misfits will recognise this scene. 4 towers overlooking one of our 5 lakes. We have 7 kilometres of canals. It's quite an extraordinary thing which the GLC created. They couldn't put surface water down drains and pipes. They decided to create a surface water drainage system, which takes all of the water from the landscape, from roads and buildings, or most of it out to the Thames ultimately. But that provides us with this phenomenal system of waterways, which are not used to their best at present. Have a lot of Thames waterfront, the view of the city and Canary Wharf in the background. We have quite a lot of parks. Can't see many people in them. I'll touch upon that possibly later on, but lots of parks. I have a huge amount of nature, quite phenomenal actually, and really exciting given what we could do with it. And in order to have a response to this, we've created a green and blue infrastructure strategy we call Living in the Landscape. And it's called Living in the Landscape because this is a place that people live in. It's not about a nature reserve. It's not about separating people and planet, if you like, or whatever. It's saying that we've got to have these two things moving together in order to make sustainable, healthy, attractive places which work, especially given the challenges we're sort of facing. And it has 5 key themes, so a sort of plan which sets out the main areas. And then we have our 5 themes: water in Thamesmead, but I think elsewhere really critical, and that's been touched upon this morning already. But given what we have in Thamesmead, the ability to really utilise our waterways, our canals and our lakes, both for sort of drainage and flooding, but also for habitat and recreation. Wilder Thamesmead, I've said at the top there, London's largest new urban forest, but we'll see where we get to, and I'm going to touch upon that later on. But a huge opportunity to really bring people and nature together. The productive landscape, we're very big on growing. We've actually just set out on a whole new series of initiatives really to get people out, to get them to grow, thinking about healthy eating, all those sorts of things as well. And Active Thamesmead, phenomenal opportunity to get everybody, but particularly kids, out into the landscape. Kids, you know, don't seem to go any further than their Game Boys, their screens, etc. And this is a picture of one of our sort of nature studies area where, since we opened it a few years ago, or reopened it, I should say, we have over 2,500 local school children coming through there doing forest schools, roasting marshmallows over fire pits and running around. And we know from feedback from teachers and others that actually, particularly for some of the more challenged children, it has a huge beneficial impact. And of course, they're running around in woodland as well, something which they don't often get the chance to do. And connecting it, Thamesmead was built around the car, really, in the 60s. It's got some enormous roads which actually do more to hinder movement than help it in many cases. So how can we make it a better connected place? So trees of Thamesmead, which is what I'm really here to talk about a little bit. And I have to sort of apologise in advance because I'm not going to set out some wonderful vision for the future because we don't quite know what it is. And I think what's been great about this morning is actually there's still a long way to go, an awful lot of research and thinking to do. And so this is really a starter for 10. We knew when we, well, I knew when I came to Thamesmead, there were an awful lot of trees there. And in fact, in the early days, we said there were 30,000 trees in Thamesmead, but then we counted them, working particularly with iTree, etc., and tree economics. And we've now got 50,000 trees at least. And we know that they can do some really good things in terms of carbon sequestration, air pollution, etc. And what's fascinating is, you know, we looked at 53,000 trees. The most common species, which I found fascinating, were hawthorn. And I don't know why there are so many hawthorn there. I think they may have been some very early hedgerows or some, you know, some historic thing, which I'd like to find out more about. Hybrid black poplar and sycamore. And I remember walking around with Keith here, who told me that Newtowns had very fast-growing trees planted in them. And of course, what again I've learned this morning is that fast-growing trees don't adapt so well. And in fact, they suffer even more as we go forward in the future. So we've got some really good, I'd say, starter for 10 data, which is really powerful. And it's interesting just to sort of get a sense as to, you know, the sort of distribution and the most common trees there, which I've already talked about: hawthorn, black poplar, sycamore, silver birch. And I think it's fair to say, again, listening to this morning, that quite a few of these are at risk going forward. Plus, of course, they're all, you know, 50, 60 years old. So some of them, particularly the big ones, are getting towards the end of their lives, perhaps. One of the things we do have, which is fantastic, and we'll use more of it, is we've got our own GIS system for Thamesmead, so we can plot trees that we've surveyed or we've plotted using various other sorts of systems. So, for example, we've got a good deal of information on the trees which our in-house arboricultural team has worked on, but also on systems like the Blue Sky aerial mapping system, where we can look at canopies and other things. So we're gathering a whole load of data around what we've got and understanding it more clearly. But what we do know is that the population is aging. There's certainly not enough young trees to maintain that. We need to focus, as people have said already, on the management of larger, more mature specimens. And we need to think about long-lived species. And also we need to think about the sort of real risks that weather can bring. And I thought it was a really pertinent point this morning about poplars being damaged. We know they tend to shed their branches anyway, but with the more extreme weather conditions, even more so. And of course, that causes issues. Just a few nice pictures of trees, really. Some of the hawthorn around some of our more historic archaeological areas, and they do have a distinct pattern, which leads me to think that they were planted deliberately in some form quite a long time ago. Hybrid black poplar, our tree gangs love them because they're always having to take the tops of them out before they get blown out. They are some of the biggest trees here, and of course they grow very fast and very well. And don't forget that Thamesmead was effectively developed on a marsh, so there is ironically plenty of water down there, unlike many of the other things we've heard about this morning. But that equally provides challenges as to what sort of species will put up with those ground conditions as well in the future. Sycamore, really sad. We've got lots of sycamore. I think it's the second or third most common tree in Thamesmead, but they're getting sooty bark disease, and that's causing them to fail. And our arboricultural team are starting to have to take them out. And as you can see from the pictures here, on the left-hand side, they perform, a really important part of the tree canopy in Thamesmead, but they are at risk. Willow, well, you can get a sense as to how lovely willows grow in Thamesmead, massive specimens, but probably not appropriate going forward. And certainly when all you have is willows, it could be quite a significant problem. So the next steps for us are to take the data we have, the knowledge we have, and develop that. I would love to develop an urban tree strategy. I think it was talked about in the previous set of talks, using the data we have, building on the iTree data we have. But most importantly, I think for me, but working in a place which is all about people, is having a co-design focus for that. I think there's no point in just planting trees all over the place without involving the people who live there. I think it would be lovely for people to grow up recognizing the tree or the trees they planted, to be able to track them, have stories about them, build that into a narrative, if you like. We've got some existing black poplar, which are hidden away on a development site. Could we bring those and use those as a good native? We've got to think about our unique and quite wet, in some cases, ground conditions, and then think about working with partners. I'm interested in talking with anybody who would like to talk to me about moving this forward. And I think going back to Peabody, taking that long-term approach, for me, this is thinking at least 30 years into the future. It's not thinking about planting 6,000 or 20,000 trees next year. I think that's the wrong approach. When I joined this project in Peabody, we were sort of getting grants and sticking trees in the ground. And I said, stop, I don't want you to do that any longer, because I don't know whether they're the right trees in the right place and whether we can even look after them. So we have to have a completely different approach, which I think today has really underlined, if anything. Oh, black poplars, yes, somewhere hidden away on a development site. They're quite fascinating trees, completely different to the hybrids, which are sort of big gawky beasts. These are rather more interesting. We've done a few things. We've planted a tiny forest, very popular, very much zeitgeist at the moment. What's interesting about that is actually that it's really engendered a strong community approach. And we had people last summer in that heat going down to the lake. You can't quite see it behind these people, getting watering cans and going up the hill and watering the trees. And actually they've done pretty well. And I think that's where we need to get to. We need to get to that ownership type approach. We've got a small community orchard, which I only found about. Our grounds maintenance team had planted themselves about a decade ago, but never told anybody about it. But we now have a small group of volunteers keenly involved in developing it and planting and building things like the dry hedges, etc., which help to define it. So very early start, massive ambitions. I think there's a huge opportunity given we've got 50-odd thousand trees, many of which are getting either towards the end of their life or being threatened by climate change and other unpleasant things. So that's just a little bit of a story as to what I'm involved in, where we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's all the new technology, this is, isn't it? It's great. I'm normally sitting at home doing presentations on Zoom and Teams, so it's really nice to be in front of everybody today. So hopefully technology is working. We'll be going through this. I'm going to try and keep an eye on the time, keep to 15 minutes as well, because I'll likely run over. So yes, as Kathryn said, I've been doing a lot of work over the last few years around urban forestry, our urban forest master plan, and I'm also now involved with, well, my other role was as an ecologist within the planning department, so I've been involved in biodiversity net gain. So conversations that have been on today so far about how we mesh these two things together have been very interesting. It is something we're wrangling with. For those of you who've not been to Birmingham before, and depending on which way you came through, you either came through something that looked like this, or you came through something like this. One of the two. These two are actually only a mile apart or thereabouts. So the first one is just across the way. I'm going to get my directions wrong, over that way. So it's just off Edgbaston Golf Course. Edgbaston, one of our leafiest suburbs. A lot of privately owned trees there, a lot of very mature trees. And the golf course has been there for many, many years. And there is some really nice big ancient sweet chestnut on there. And obviously this one is taken from across the city centre. So looking at across a fairly treeless environment from the top of 103 Colmore Road, which is just up the road. So yeah, two different extremes. Birmingham, like a lot of big cities, it faces a lot of challenges. We've got a population of 1.1 million and rising, and we've got a tree for every person in the city, if we count them all up. We've got one of the youngest populations in Europe. Significant numbers of our wards are in the top 10 percentile for indices of multiple deprivation, high levels of years life lost, air pollution, urban heat island, pluvial and fluvial flooding, demand for housing. And we've seen, as many other people have, that demand for open space, quality open space, over the COVID pandemic has really brought to the fore those inequalities or inequity of provision, which is part of what we're going to cover on this. Other things that we've seen, city improvements, we call them. So we've got Corporation Street. So anybody who came through from New Street, if you come out the station, you might have looked up New Street. It used to have trees on it. Now it's been much improved by putting the tram down it and taking all the trees out. These sorts of things, these demands for housing, these city improvements, this loss of trees really led to a public swelling of public movement some time back. Never got to the quite extent that we've seen for Sheffield and Plymouth recently, but it did start that movement in terms of campaigning about the loss of urban trees. That led in 2017 to our leader of the council declaring that we would have a tree policy review and that it was going to be led by a cross-party board of elected members. So we're getting the politics back in here. So because it was cross-party, it was not one party's vision being enforced on another. We had members from all groups, and I was appointed to be, I suppose, their point of contact for all sort of discussions and conversations. And out of that, we came through with a whole series of policy recommendations. A couple of key ones on here, which I think point well to Chrissy and also comments about the implementation of the use of CAVAC for all trees within project areas. That was with our highways teams, that's with our in-house builders, but that's now been rolled into our planning policies as well. So that's across the board there. We had aspirations for canopy cover. We strengthened our policies and planning conditions, and then tried to put more information out about planting quality, species diversity, integration into multifunctional GI. And on top of this, we needed an overarching plan that set out clearer vision for the future. So in 2021, we were able to produce our co-created urban forest master plan for Birmingham 2021 to 2051, so a 30-year period. That was co-created between Birmingham Tree People, which is our community tree warden group, ourselves. Cecil from the Nature-Based Solutions Institute was integral with that, as was Treeconomics and Kenton, and Keith also played a part in feeding into this plan. The introduction was also co-authored as well by both our leader and our chief exec. So we've got both the council leaderships there putting their name to the plan, and this plan was approved by full council as well. So all 101 elected members, good buy-in across the council there. Still get some disagreements with councillors, but at least we can point back to a plan that they agreed on and voted on. Our vision that we set out was having more trees for Birmingham to deliver benefits for health and nature and climate as well for all communities within the city now and in the future as part of an inclusive and sustainable urban forest.
And we were going to be delivering that by developing a diverse and resilient urban forest, building meaningful relationships between trees and all members of Birmingham's diverse communities, managing an urban forest in an evidence-based and highly professional way, and working collaboratively in partnership and crossing communities, ownership, sectors and scales. And we have a whole series of KPIs in this master plan following 3 key areas. So trees and forest structure, community framework and sustainable resource management approach. So this is the bit we're getting onto now. So one of the KPIs for us was looking around relative tree canopy cover. And we had some data around this, but we had different data sources and we need to make a decision about which data source we were going to be using in order to make sure we've got consistent, reliable, comparable data on canopy cover. I still think there are some issues in terms of what we see data on year to year and over the different assessments, but at least we've got a process going forward. So we now have set our relative tree canopy cover. We've done that in a number of ways. We've worked with, we used the national tree map from Blue Sky, and we've imported this into Tree Plotter canopy app. So we've got it, we can see it by constituency, ward, but more importantly for us, I think breaking that down to the lower super output level as well. So that brings that down to that sort of neighbourhood census block. So we can start to match this up with all the data that we can find at low super output area levels as well. Also within that master plan is around considering the wider environmental considerations as well. So that's thinking about those urban heat island, the pluvial, fluvial flooding, the air quality, and the map that's shown here is it PM25? I think that says there. It's heat map for the city. So you can see where there are hot spots in there in terms of that. So we've taken these data and combined those into a citywide map, again at that lower super output level. So not only do we have the existing urban tree canopy cover at this level, but we have possible urban tree cover, impervious surface level data, which we've extracted from the Ordnance Survey Green Space Master Map. But then we've also overlaid with air quality and urban heat island mapping, which Emma and the students at the University of Birmingham were kind enough to produce. And then added to that, we've added out those individual indices of multiple deprivation. So basically, we've come up with, I suppose, it's almost like a climate vulnerability and risk mapping. We've done some work again with Emma, and we've got a CRVA map for the city. And we've also, through a Future Parks Accelerator, done an environmental justice mapping, which takes some of this data, but also looks at quality and access to green space. And to be honest, they're all very similar. They all show the same deficits pretty much in the same places, and shows where we really need to be taking action most. On this system, because we're able to identify where those areas of low canopy cover are and also other influencing factors, that's giving us a way of prioritizing where we need to be taking action first to benefit those communities most. So we can add or weight different rankings from those IMD indices and then come out with a whole series of areas that we need to focus on. As part of that, we're also able to start to look at what sort of impact that might have on those local communities as well. So yes, while we can generate some in this idea of the numbers of trees we might be needing, it is about establishing the right trees. It's establishing those trees well. But we can start to also look using the iTree Eco metrics that are built into this platform, the sorts of benefits that we're going to see from there in terms of what current monetary benefits are, the model benefits, and the net benefits in terms of carbon sequestration, stormwater interception, air quality improvement. So it provides us a very good tool to communicate with members of the public and councillors, elected members, MPs, etc., and shows why we're prioritising our spend in certain areas of the city and perhaps not in others. And again, for funders, it works really well because it allows us to sort of show a very targeted approach that meets their objectives as well as meeting our own. Just taking a close-up view, I mean, this is just a real close-in snapshot of part of Birmingham, but I think, you know, for a highly urbanised city such as Birmingham with huge competition for land, housing, recreation, etc., we don't have those land availability for larger woodland plantations like we're saying a lot of the grant systems are coming forward for. But we do have thousands of locations for a few trees, and it is those few trees that need to be really well targeted and how we place those out in the environment. In these sort of locations, absolutely non-native trees are going to be probably the best that we can do because they're going to have to deal with harsh conditions that our native trees just aren't ready for. So But with my biodiversity hat on, I know that some of those species are going to be beneficial to biodiversity, to a range of different species. You know, thinking about using single flower cherries rather than double flowered cherries, we know that they'll be able to be utilised by pollinator species. So we can be very selective and still provide biodiversity benefits there. Engaging our tree wardens as well and other community volunteers in undertaking tree planting site constraints assessment is going to be key in order to how we deliver this going forward. So this is trying to think about how we move forward for that 30 years, how we target our tree planting. We're also looking at how we use this data to inform our sort of tree requirements over the next sort of 30 years or so. So here we've got some data. This is just our highways tree data. So 75,000 trees on our highways network, more or less there. And we've got the data out from there, and we're able to see on that sort of 30-20-10 ratio what the various split is between family, genus and species. And this gives us some indication of what our future requirements might be, because we can align this then to the quality, the survey data, which shows us the tree quality, life expectancy, etc. So we can start to think about how can we better forward plan and have the conversation with those tree producers about what we need in 5-6 years' time based on those records and this sort of data in terms of split of composition for resilience. Thinking about moving forward in terms of planning policy, we've got our future city plan, which is taking over from our existing spatial plan for the city centre area. And this has got very much of a net zero focus to it. One of the chapters within there is the City of Nature, and that's led to a whole 25-year City of Nature plan, or a GI strategy, it's a green infrastructure strategy for the city. That's divided into a whole series of different subsections, partly around the natural environment, nature and climate change. So that's what this section covers. And within those plans, we've got, I suppose, stronger visions about what we want to see. So looking at city greenways, expanding the urban forest, particularly in those urban areas, thinking about creating park webs. How do we link the existing park spaces together and create new park spaces that we've got that joined up approach to give people more access to green space? Edible cities as well, local growing environments, urban orchards, reviving our waterways. You mentioned about the amount of canals. Birmingham's got 250 miles of rivers and streams and 35 miles of canals, I think it is. So we've got quite a lot of urban waterways within the city to take advantage of. This also ties into other strategies and plans as well. So thinking about our Birmingham transport plan, which again is another sort of 25-30 year view. How can we've already got in there about the reallocation of road space, taking space away from the car dominated environment and moving it to a multimodal travel, or even moving it to green space. So here we've got flyover or a vision of what the flyover could be, which is just up the road in Hockley. Do we need to maintain that flyover there, or could that actually become an urban park space with tree planting on it? Perhaps not quite like that, because we have to put a lot of soil on to get that many trees, but this is the sort of vision, and this is the direction that we are seeing in our strategic planning documents. It's integrated through. We've got specific chapters. We've got specific details. So I think there's been a lot of work. I think the data that we've been producing in terms of climate risk and vulnerability have really added to the bolstering of this picture and the strengthening of detail around this. And that's me done. I don't know whether that's 15 minutes. There we go. Thank you.
It was 14 minutes. So can I have
14 minutes.
Can I have one question?
You can have one question.
It's did it cost a lot to pull together the Urban Forest Master Plan? Is it something other local authorities could reproduce?
Did it cost a lot to pull together the Urban Forest Master Plan? I think depending on where you look, you could get any cost from sort of, maybe £20,000 to £150,000, say. I think it depends on the level of data that you've already got. Most local authorities, you should have a fair idea of some of the data. We actually, like I say, we partnered with Birmingham Tree People for that. So they led a lot of the community engagement sessions, and we co-created the document between all of us. So really, we were paying, the consultants time to sort of help support, do some of the pen holding on that. So I think you can do something reasonably cheaply, I suppose. I mean, I think it's a lot of money, but when I see how much we're paying for some of our planning documents, our local plan review, I think we've set aside something like £800,000 for that. So, it's a pittance compared with that, isn't it? But think about the benefits, those long-term benefits that you're going to get out of that.
100 to 100. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn, and thank you, Emma. Yeah, so I'm going to continue on the topic of ecosystem services, and my angle is more on garden trees. I work with the Royal Horticultural Society, and we use ecosystem services often to describe benefits that trees provide. And often what I get asked is, what should I plant for the future? You know, from gardeners who want to plant a new tree, if they're interested in actually ecosystem services, they want a golden tree, you know, a tree that can provide all the services and can also grow in a warmer climate and can also mitigate climate change. However, what I usually throw back at them is what service is most important for you, because motivation in gardens can be different from public spaces. So these that I've listed here are services that we are focusing on within my group of research. I particularly look at cooling, which is of course the topic of today. I also look at flood mitigation or rainfall capture, carbon sequestration. I have colleagues looking into support for wildlife, pollution mitigation, noise reduction, also well-being. And of course, a lot of people just want a beautiful tree in their garden. So why are trees in gardens important? So the UK is quite unique in that about 30% of the urban space in the UK is gardens. So they can actually make quite a big difference. And trees within these gardens play a key role because they're longer living, large stature compared to other plants. Services vary between species, as a lot of research shows, but we still lack kind of connecting a lot of species to specific services. And as mentioned, motivation management often differs in private garden to public spaces. If you have planted a tree in the garden, you probably had an economic investment in that yourself, so you're more likely to look after your tree and it's more likely to grow to mature age, but it's also likely to be a smaller type of tree than in public spaces. And regulating services are often related to tree size. So we often hear that the bigger the better, like a larger canopy, you're going to have more rainfall capture, larger stem, you're going to have more carbon stored. But that's not so helpful when you want to motivate gardeners to also have trees in their garden. And there's a trend of gardeners getting smaller and smaller in the UK, and that has implications for how many trees are going to be room for in these gardens. And so we argue that species-specific information is needed also for gardeners to know what to plant. I just like this picture. It's taken in my neighborhood, and I just think it shows how much of a difference just a tree can make in a green space or in a neighborhood. So this is data from our website where we ask our members to put in what kind of species they have in their garden. So it is selected genera from the top 10 trees that are planted. And of course, this is quite biased because this is RHS members. So they're really kind of keen gardeners. But you can see that the three top is like Prunus, Acer, and Malus. And you can tell that people really, you know, color has a big impact. You want to have beautiful spring blossom or beautiful color range in the leaves, but also just trees that had a lot of cultivars to select from in a smaller and medium scale. And while I was making this presentation, I got this inquiry, so I'm just going to use it as an example, because leyland cypress is often like a conflicted species that some people love and some people hate, just because it's very common. And the inquiry I got was that someone wanted to cut it down, a 50-year-old leyland cypress in their garden because it was shading too much for their greenhouse and they wanted to grow vegetables. And of course, it has a very dense crown and high leaf area index. And so they were asking how much CO2 would this have been stored for all the years it was 50-year-old. And so I mentioned to my tree, the iTree feature, and estimated about 700 kilo of carbon up to that stage in their life. And I said it probably under, you know, in the soil, it will also be carbon that will be released if you disturb the soil, but it depends on what you want in your garden. And I asked my colleague who's looking into wildlife, and I was surprised to know that, you know, it's a favorite hunting spot for a lot of birds, such as skullcrests, and also for nesting because of the dense canopy. So often things we don't think about maybe also are important. And then if you look into our websites, you can see that it's very versatile. It can grow in all kinds of soil. And of course, on this TDAG guide, you can see that it's very tolerant to droughts. So you have an intolerant to shade. But of course, it's a tree that can get too big and too dense in your garden. So it really depends on what you're looking for. Just to give you an insight of what we're doing of research at the RHS at the moment. And I work on an ecosystem service trial where I'm measuring 20 different cultivars, and my main focus is on these regulating services. I'll come back to that a bit later. We have some surveys. My colleague Chloe Sutcliffe is looking at sustainability, and she's also including some questions on trees there. We have a master student looking at cooling potential and how that is affected by leaf color. And we also have RHS My Garden, which we try to collect data of what species people have in their garden to get motivational information. And then Tiana Blanusa has, of course, done a lot of work on ecosystem services related to hedges. So this is very fresh of the print result from the sustainability survey that we did. And this is not just RHS members, this is across the UK, a selected sample. It was about 2,000 respondents. And the first kind of percentage we got a result is that a little bit more people had planted trees in the last 3 years and had cut down trees in the last 3 years. But of course, we have to be very careful with that number, selling as a positive story, as it has been mentioned before, that mature species will deliver a lot more ecosystem services than a newly planted tree. We don't have a number of like how small or how big they were, but because a lot of the reasoning was availability of space, there probably were large trees cut down. And then if they planted a new seedling, this is going to take years before that actually comes to that same level of delivery. This is also a picture from a garden in my neighborhood. This is the massive redwoods that just like absolutely take all the space of this little garden. And I remember seeing it and thinking, these people must really love this tree not to cut it down. And you can see it's just like towering over that house. And if this is your tree, then yeah, it's a lot of trees. There's a lot of examples like this in Surrey gardens. So yeah, number one reason why people will cut it down, too large for the space available, then trees too close to a building, trees were creating too much shade, trees had died due to extreme weather, as was mentioned earlier, make way for new construction, tree causing subsidence, and tree causing allergies. But the really top 3 reasons can be related to size and appropriate selection for a space. And this is also, I just want to mention then that it can have an implication if gardens get smaller and smaller, or what can be planted there. So a lot of research has already gone into traits connected to ecosystem services. Maddie has done some great work on that. And we have, for instance, some traits like wide and tall multi-stratified species will have a high rainfall capture, rough leaf surface, hairy leaves, larger leaves absorb more pollution, density is related to cooling and shading, light leaf color is related to solar radiation. And we know that the cooling capacity of trees can vary very much. If you look in literature, it can go between almost nothing to, for instance, through transpiration and reduced air temperature between 0.5 and 8 degrees. Now, Maddie mentioned earlier 5 degrees in the neighborhood in Britain, which is really good to have some data coming in on like the average air temperature in the garden or in trees with trees versus no trees. Shade can reduce it a lot more in kind of directly shading an area, but it all depends on the climate, the environment, but also down to species specific effectiveness. And based on kind of the higher transpiration rate, the more cooling effects, and that denser the crown, the more cooling through shading. We looked through 9 different cultivars, which are typical for garden space, which are smaller and medium cultivars. And this is the experiment I run for 2 years now, where we have continuously measured sap flow measurements, a proxy for transpiration, growing medium moisture, and have a weather station on site. We measure point biomass measurements, leaf area, crown dimension, and gas exchange. Again, measurements on site and what these can actually deliver rather than modeling it. And this is just so you can get an overview of how they look from more the experimental design of the view. This is 4 of the 6 blocks. And I mean, these numbers are not going to be so impressive for people working with a lot of bigger trees. This is just like the first season. And keep in mind, they're very small, some of them down to 3 centimeter in diameters. But there was still a large difference between carbon storage and how much they put on from one growing season, which means that we can still motivate gardeners to say, no, there is a difference, even though a larger tree would capture more. It's better that you have one in your garden and that can deliver different services, a different range of it. So we want to rank it. And then I haven't put down the species name here because it's a collaboration with a commercial partner, but this will be released soon anyway. And this other graph is on the leaf level, so carbon capture in an instant with the infrared gas analyzer. So here you can also see there was quite a large range of difference, and these are just from the small 9 different species. And this was taken on a hot day in July. And then this was during July last year. And because our trees were irrigated, they actually never stopped transpiring even during the hottest temperatures, which is good news. But there is a big difference in when they started to increase in transpiration. So this is sap flux density, which is the proxy for transpiration, and then air temperature on the x-axis. So you can see there's a very difference in when they start to increase the transpiration in relation to temperature and when they start to plateau, but none of them actually decreased. And so just to summarize what I've talked through, gardens, both private and public, has potential to contribute to increased canopy cover, biodiversity and ecosystem services. Trees are being cut down due to inappropriate species selection, where we can come in and actually guide people, which is what we want to continue to do. Research is needed to fuel the advice gardeners are given. So we still don't have like a selected guide which are best for ecosystem services, but it's what we're working towards. And specifically what trees are going to be appropriate for smaller space while also growing in a warmer climate. And range in carbon storage, transpiration and crown size was found in the cultivars measured from our experiment. So we just started a new experiment now with 10 new species that we're going to do the same with for the next 2 years. And I just wanted to thank my collaborators, Frank Matthews, and for being invited here today. Thank you for listening.
Right, hello. And I tend to move around a bit, so, and I'll go back to the microphone. I can't move around a bit. But I don't want the mobile one, no, that looks silly. Anyway, it's pointed out to me when I stood up here earlier on, putting my slides on, I've got 30-odd slides here, and Emma said, you'll never get through 30 slides in 15 minutes. She's probably right. So, can I have a little alarm bell? So it's a long title, and it's a long title that sort of, it raises this question about why is it an understanding of nursery production systems important if successful transplanting and final independence in the landscape is to be achieved? And I think it's a really pertinent question, because I'm going to try and be a little bit controversial. There's been a lot of topics discussed today. A lot of really good research taking us forward, greater knowledge, brilliant stuff. So no, I don't want what I'm going to say next to actually offend those great researchers that have gone before, because I know most of them personally, you know. Anyway, but if we're looking at more research and we're building up our knowledge base, isn't there a time to look backwards as well? Because the question, I think, is, are we actually applying the research and knowledge we already know about? I'll wager we could go, no disrespect to anybody in the room, but I wager we could walk no less than 800 yards from this building and we'd find examples of badly planted trees. I think without any doubt. Simon, you can correct that later on if you like. Would you all like to come up to the window to have a look at it? It's not one of Howard's trees, by the way, or not one of Howard's systems. So why should we assume that new knowledge and research will improve the situation? And if you go away with one message here from today, take away this idea of a performance gap. Where's the performance gap between what we know and then what we're actually delivering on the ground? So back to the title. So we're talking about nurseries. If I go around this room, I'll wager if I was to actually speak to you with any, or question you with any intensity, then your knowledge of nursery production systems would be lacking or misplaced or partial. So we'll start. Here's where the nursery industry starts from. So if I was to suggest that to my managing director, he'd laugh at me. So we make interventions. So here's the first intervention or two interventions. We produce trees from either cuttings or seed. Okay, nursery production. Here's an example of what we're delivering in the landscape. Every bit of that root system is wrong. Every bit of that root system has got damage to it. The shape of the root system reveals nursery practice. The planting depth or the soil depth is also a nursery intervention. And then the final planting depth, which is on the right stem, all of that leads to failure. So what I would ask you to consider as I'm talking through this is nursery production. The interventions are designed to produce a tree of a quality and a species that is required by the marketplace. But perhaps you might like to ask the question, who's setting the standards for the nursery trees that are coming out? And I would suggest that very often they're nursery standards for nursery standards, and you folks are having absolutely no input into what you actually want. So would you go buy a fridge where the person in the shop actually said to you, this is what you're going to have? What I'd ask the question, what do you want if we're going to be successful with urban forestry? So here we go. I'm just going to look below ground. There's the idealised root system on my left, and there's the reality. Here's what happens when you're planting the tree, when we're doing seedling production. We lift from the seed bed. There's the seed bed on the top. We make a cut, we cut the taproot. What happens is the root system, which would be just below the soil depth, is actually now 6 to 8 inches lower than it would be if it was growing naturally. Same happens with cuttings. Look at the depth. Don't worry, you're not going to take all of this in, and this is a 2-hour, and I'm going to leave that, so I'm just doing below ground. But there we have it. Can you see where the primary root system is on the cutting? It's already 6 inches, 8 inches below. There we are, same thing demonstrated on the root system. There's the result. Parish chanticleer, planting depth, primary lateral root development, something called root shank, adventitious roots, root flare. You can see that your strongest root system is probably 8 or 9 inches or more lower than you would want it to be. You compound that with the planting depth and your root system's already a foot deeper than it wants to be. Nursery interventions. Why to understand it? It's a question of where you're going to plant, the depth you're going to plant. We bud and we seed. There's the budding point, the swelling on the stem. So, is that a good budding point or not a good budding point? Nursery practice. How do you identify the difference? Here's the 3 main production systems in the UK, and the title of the talk, or what's put on the programme, it makes it sound as though I'm going to stand here and say to you, this is the right one, this is the wrong one. No, they all work. But they all have different advantages and disadvantages. So which do you choose? Understand what makes the advantages and disadvantages of each relevant to what it is you're actually doing. Because there is merit in all of them. There's a place for all of them, but it's understanding what goes in producing them. So a quick run through. There's our idealised root system with diagrams. There's what we call a hockey stick root system that's caused when the seedling is laid out in the nursery bed. That root distortion will never correct itself. That root distortion is there for life. So we look at the ideal, go back one, have a look at the ideal. There it is on the right with the right. Here's the reality. So Acer campestri, Acer freemanni autumn blaze, Ailanthus, Acer campestri. You can see certain similarities in that they all have got that dominant root system low down. They've all got that root shank. They've all got a budding point. Some of them have got a budding point. Some more. Crataegus, Platanus, Saulvus, Crataegus, Platanus. You guys are handling these things either as a root ball container or a bare root plant. What do you understand about the root system? What can you read of that root system? What are you looking for? All of that has got to affect how you plant the tree. I would suggest root balls. Here we are, root balls, bane of my life. Okay, production of a root ball, cut 1 is first cut point, 2 is 3 cut point, 2 is second cut point, 3 is third cut point. You will notice there's a proliferation of growth at each cut point. That means the root ball, when it's lifted, should actually be a continuation, just fibrous root. How often is that varied? Here's what sometimes happens. The tree is lifted from the ground. Most of the fibrous roots left in the ground, and the picture of the catalpa root is what you're actually planting in the landscape. Is there any wonder it fails? There's the root system. It's been researchers shown research. Yeah, there was some good research once. So research has demonstrated as much as 95% of a root system can be left in the ground. Specifications, you know, and all the specifications we've got in the nursery for anything, we never see anything like this. Minimum size of root ball, number of times transplanted when related to size of tree being purchased. Very simple, it's never used. Okay, mounding around the root ball, I'm going to mess containerisation. Lots of mythology about containerisation, it's all a nonsense. Air pots are as good as white bags, are as good as green bags, are as good as black bags. It makes no bloody difference at all. It's actually the time that the tree's in the container. And it's all timing. If the tree's in a container too long, the root system will spoil. There we are, that's the mythology bit. That's what happens. Here you are, that's a plug. That root system there, bear in mind that's irreparably damaged. Moving on, some more examples and extreme examples at the bottom. All of that is not the container itself, it's the length of time the tree's in the container. So again, understanding nursery systems, some great examples there from the Gilman Laboratory in Florida. More examples. And bear in mind, this root circling, that doesn't lead to failure immediately. That's a 10, 15, 20-year job after you've planted it. That's when that fails. Idealised, containerised root systems shaved at the end, and then back to the beginning. I think I've nearly done it. So constant calls for research, same thing, new species and a preference for more innovation. I genuinely believe we are seemingly incapable of applying what we already know. And I'll just have a think about that, because I think that really is significant. Because when you're going home tonight, have a look. Have a look at trees that are planted. You tell me how many exhibit poor crown development. They've got structural problems waiting to happen that are rocking in the ground, or you'll have stakes that are now being engulfed by the tree, ties where the tree's swallowing the ties out, grids that are disappearing into the root system. We know all this, but we don't do it. Why? In my view, this is the challenge. So how do we get from what's on my right, which is the nursery row, to a picture of trees successfully planted in Stockholm, in Sweden, using an underground system, not the same as Howard's, but a system that actually does exactly the same. It provides soil volume, and we forget the critical elements for the tree. What are they? Air, water, light. We constantly forget that. So there we are. I think I've finished in time. Thanks for listening. Any questions? There you go. How do I do?